We can't go on like this.
And you just have to deal with it.
Go find yourself.
There's a whole part of me you've never seen.
Life, Sunday, ABC TV and ABC iView. How did an abusive husband get away with murder for over 30 years?
This series of crimes is unparalleled in Australian history.
The Family Court Murders starts Tuesday, May 10 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Hello, Manny Tsigas with the top stories on ABC News. Labor unveils its suite of Pacific plans, promising to boost foreign aid and, for the first time, create a permanent citizenship path for Pacific Islanders. The ALP insists the package will help restore Australia's standing in the region following the China-Solomon Islands Security Pact. However, the Prime Minister has already labelled the plan a farce. The push for a 25% pay rise for aged care workers kicked off today in the Fair Work Commission. The Health Services Union is arguing the pay is simply too low for the level of responsibility aged care workers have. The case will be heard over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Public school teachers across New South Wales are set to strike next week over concerns about pay and working conditions. Teachers claim they've been left with no choice as their dispute with the state government intensifies. The Premier says he's disappointed by their decision. And Russia has warned the West that it risks World War III if it keeps supplying weaponry to Ukraine. The Kremlin has attacked 5 railway stations to disrupt supplies of foreign weapons to eastern Ukraine. The UN Secretary-General is meeting with the Russian president in Moscow to discuss the war. And those are the latest stories. I'm Manny Tsigas. Bye for now.
Hello, I'm Julia Baird. Welcome to The Drum. Tonight, we're coming to you from Murwillumbah at the Tweed Regional Gallery, which is on Bundjalung land in the New South Wales Northern Rivers region. Now, with a series of consecutive flooding disasters, the election is the last thing on a lot of people's minds here. But we'll be looking at whether there's been sufficient support for people and businesses in places like Ballina and Lismore to rebuild, and some of the astonishing ways in which the community came together here to support each other. And we'll be talking about Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, of course, and ask our panellists what they might do with, say, $61 billion. And joining me on the panel with this glorious view behind us today, Principal of Cabbage Tree Island Public School, Dion Anderson. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Co-founder and Executive Director of Digital Rights Advocacy Group. He's got a bit to say about Elon Musk. It's called Access Now. Brett Solomon, welcome.
Thank you.
Mayor of Ballina Shire Council and Chair of the Northern Rivers Joint Organisation, Sharon Cadwallader, welcome. And Mayor of Lismore City Council, a very busy man, Steve Krieg. Steve, g'day.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And if you want to join in on Twitter, you can using the hashtag The Drum, and we are also on Facebook. Now, as the election campaign rolls on, there are some signs that voters are increasingly disillusioned with both major parties. From the so-called teal independents to more reactionary minor parties, it's increasingly possible that this election could dent the dominance of the historic two-party paradigm. Over the last few weeks, support for the major parties in the polls has been languishing. The number of people saying they'd vote first for Labor is at 37%, while it's 36% for the coalition. When preferences are considered, that moves to 53% for Labor and 47% for the coalition. Now, while there's still more than 3 weeks for both major parties to excite the electorate, some, like the political editor of The Australian, believe time is running out.
While all elections are different, the low primary votes for both the major parties, coupled with 2 unpopular leaders, continues to demonstrate the depth of modern electoral disillusionment. If the 27% of voters who have parked their votes with minor parties and independents might be looking to shift, they aren't showing any sign of it yet.
Sharon, 27% of voters tending to put their votes with independents or minor parties. Now, you were briefly with the Nationals, but you've run as an independent. and have been an independent for many years. Does this shift in the electorate make sense to you?
Look, it doesn't surprise me that those numbers are coming through, because generally I think this is our democratic process. People want to see some changes happening. They're not necessarily comfortable with the way things are panning out, and I think social media's got a big part to play with that, and particularly seeing with the lockdowns that we've seen with COVID, and people have had more time to do a lot of investigating and I guess Facebooking and things like that. So I think that's how a lot of information's being spread, whether that's true, false or indifferent. People are taking more of an interest because they've had more time on their hands. And I believe this is what we're seeing now playing out in those numbers.
But taking a particular kind of interest, so, you know, like away from the major parties. So there's more of a sense of disillusionment or distrust.
Well, they are, but that's also due to the natural disasters that we've seen over the last few years. And we've certainly had our fair share of those, with droughts, with COVID, floods, bushfires, you name it, we've had it. Government has had to deal with such a lot, and you can't make all the people happy all the time. So therefore people have taken a concerted interest in politics, and this is what we're seeing play out. It's very difficult to please everyone when you're trying to manage such disasters.
Now, Steve, someone who has taken an interest in politics, you ran as mayor, suddenly found yourself being signed in January 11 this year. We have seen a lot of independents become mayors. Can you explain that for us?
Oh, for me, I don't want to be aligned with a political party necessarily. I agree with different aspects of each of the parties, but I don't want to be tied down. I'm in my role for the people of Lismore and its villages, not for a party as such. And I think local government in particular is really going to struggle if they align themselves with a political party down the track.
Why?
Because local government especially is a real hands-on form of government. You're close to the people that you're representing and serving. And to have to follow a party line in particular, which might not suit your local government area, I think's asking a bit much. And that's just my personal opinion, obviously. For example, you know, a dam is a hot topic at the moment in our local government area, and it has been for many, many years. Now, I don't want to have to be tied to a particular viewpoint. I want to represent the majority of the people in my electorate to what they want.
You don't want to be bound. It could be also, I mean, we look at some of the polling. I think it was the Australian Financial Review Ipsos poll that found that both candidates from the major parties ranked at the lowest level of competence we've seen in terms of the polling for 27 years. And when it comes to local government, it's about competence, isn't it? About getting stuff done. You can't make a promise and then 3 years later go, oh, right, about that.
Well, I think you're right. And I also think another problem when we're dealing with federal election issues at the moment is that I think both major parties are playing it a bit safe because of the social media impacts. They're very grey candidates, if I can use that term. There's no one person standing up and taking on that statesman's role or taking on that view that, let's say, John Howard took with gun reform or, you know, those sorts of bigger issues. It's very much
politically risky, but also demonstrate courage
at
the same time. I just want to bring in Brett Solomon. You were the first executive director of Get Up, which tried to very much, you know, encourage people to think outside the major parties in a lot of way and to generate kind of community activism. How do you interpret these polls?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, what both of the mayors have said, I think, are reflective of the global and also part of an international trend as well, which is that people are concerned about traditional politics, concerned about disillusioned by politicians. You know, we've seen the idea that people are diversified. They're not like, I'm Labor, I'm Liberal, I'm Green, but I might be socially progressive or economically conservative or a mix of those. And I think when we started Get Up back in the day, that was like trying to create political infrastructure that would respond to the political needs of the population. It wasn't just that you would vote, every 3 or 4 years or whatever the electorate was, that you actually had a say all the time on all of the issues. And we've seen that, as been mentioned, this issue of social media is now Facebooking, as you said, is like, it's so relevant to our lives. People are able to engage with a candidate's position on the Solomon Islands, or a candidate's position on inflation, or a candidate's position on climate change. And all of those things can manifest themselves in one independent, but not necessarily how people align to one political party.
Dion, when we talk about federal election and we look at the different competence or trustworthiness of the major candidates, and it's neck and neck, and there's kind of gotcha moments and a whole heap of pundits offering different viewpoints and analyses, does this seem at all relevant to the day-to-day struggles that you have?
I think currently, with what everyone is dealing with on a local basis, the election is important, but I think we are just attempting to deal with the day-to-day struggles. I need to know that our communities need to know that they have food, that they have accommodation, that they are being taken care of. They know where they're going to be sleeping tomorrow night. So we have all of these bigger issues happening within federal, but if I actually speak to community as well and I ask them how are they feeling about the types of support that have been offered, I know that they feel let down. I know that there is a common thread around knowing that people are looking for photo opportunities, which is not necessarily within the best interest of the community, and taking in consideration what our community is really dealing with. So it's not as though it's not a spoken topic, but I think we have to be realistic about what our priorities are at the moment. We need our families and community well taken care of, and not empty promises. And I think we've seen some empty promises, especially of late, around what is needed. We don't need people to tell our community what they need. They need to start listening so that we're getting the right appropriate support. And the disappointment around the coalition not even taking a moment to speak to people on the ground, that's just not good enough. People don't forget that. That is part of why we are struggling with thinking about what is the right step forward. Who knows? You're putting trust into people who make empty promises.
I want to come back to that question of support. Actually, I want to talk about it now, because here in the New South Wales Northern Rivers region, frustration with politics, as Dion is saying, has a very specific focus. Hit by 2 major floods in as many months, locals are struggling to navigate funding support. There are a number of different state and federal grants available, but there's confusion about what to access and how. And there's also the question of when money might flow, with reports last week only 2% of the back home grants offering residents up to $20,000 to repair their properties have been processed. This morning I headed over to ABC Radio North Coast in Lismore to hear from locals, alongside breakfast host Joanne Shoebridge, about how government support has been received. Well, the switchboard lit up.
This is ABC North Coast.
Julia, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Northern Rivers.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. We really wanted to come here to get a sense of what actually is going on. Do people have enough support? It's been like an incredibly traumatic and difficult experience. And are we hearing everything that's really happening?
Let's go now to some of our callers.
I feel like I've been abandoned by the government, and when I have to deal with government departments, it's just like they are on some kind of go slow, and I just get caught up in their red tape.
Is that both federal and state government?
Yes, both. I've lost over $25,000 worth of equipment, and I can't even get them to answer the phone. I'm just still waiting. It's just infuriating.
Let's go to Chloe from Lismore. Just tell us a little bit about your story and your parents' story.
So they were just trying to get some assistance from the government. Obviously, they were flood affected. They'd lost their house, their business. They had no power, no computers. So they were with Centrelink at the desk, and he explained to them that they were wasting his time and Centrelink's time because they should have done this online. So they were quite distraught about that. My parents had never been Centrelink customers before.
Right, so you really, part of your story is the fact, you know, people who are not really used to asking the government for support, who are not used to going through these systems and suddenly finding that they're not treated with the respect or urgency that the situation might ask for.
Yeah, and it's emotional too. Like each time you've got to relive and almost prove your case.
Look, I just feel like we're just living through this gigantic experiment. You know, the rain event was like nothing that we've seen before. The emergency response turned out to be almost experimental in its nature. The clean-up is mind-blowing.
Very uncomfortable feeling like you're in the middle of an experiment.
As much as Lismore is a flood town, we are not the only flood town. If you believe the science, it's almost inevitable that one day an event like that we've lived through and we are living through is going to happen again.
James from Lismore.
On the morning of the flood, we were picked off the roof of our home. So we've lost everything in the house. We've lost our entire business. I've thrown out approximately $400,000 to $500,000 worth of high-end catering equipment. And I've thrown out in excess of $60,000 worth of food and product. And it's slowly killing our town. I know families that are leaving this town, and so those kids leave town with their families, so there's need for a few less teachers in the schools, so that's people who are suddenly not in your community going out to buy a new set of tyres for their car or taking their family out for a family event dinner, and the town starts to die. And that, I'm afraid, is what we're seeing, and unless we find a way to change the way Lismore responds to these events, then I fear we are consigning Lismore to a slow death.
Just a deluge of callers we had this morning, Steve. A lot of people saying they feel frustrated and overwhelmed as well as traumatised, and a sense that they're trying to access support and it's difficult, that politicians have come and made announcements, but it's taking a long time for the support to come through. Does that ring true with your experience, with what you're seeing on the streets and the homes?
Unfortunately, it does. I've met with many politicians from both sides of politics, and they do come with announcements, which is really great. But the time it takes from the announcement being made to it actually coming to fruition seems to be taking a long time. And there also seems to be a lot of different avenues that you have to go through to access these grants or this support, which is frustrating. I know myself, you know, our office, which was 12.5 metres above floodwater height, obviously went underwater. There goes our filing system, our computer system, all of those sorts of things. So when they're asking for serial numbers off your coffee machine or different things like that, you just don't have it. We're literally doing all of our communications on our mobile phones because that's all we have.
And Steve, you were living on the property of your business as well, right? So you've been displaced too. So how's that process been? I know when we contacted you today, you were getting a dehumidifier.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to comprehend, and even when you come to Lismore or one of the affected areas to visit, it's the little things that you don't understand. And as I said, like, you know, people have offered to buy us things like sheet sets or towels or something. We don't have a bathroom, we don't have a bed to put on a sheet. You know, we've got some beautiful friends in the town next door to us in Casino that brought us a washing basket full of clothes because you literally don't have underwear or socks.
So you didn't have thongs.
Didn't have a pair of thongs. Didn't have a, you know, it's those little things that you take for granted every single day that thousands upon thousands of people have to rebuild, that the comprehension of that is really hard to portray through a TV screen or a journalistic report. And even 5 minutes up the road in Gunnellabar, you know, in an area that wasn't affected, you know, the thing that made me cry the most directly after the flood was watching a guy mow his lawn, because they're the little things that you just literally take for granted in your day-to-day life.
The normalcy of it.
Yeah.
Just out with a mower.
Yep.
That would have grown so much during the rains as well. Sharon, I'm interested in your view on the political response. If I can just read a couple, because we got texts this morning when we were on ABC local radio as well. Someone saying, Robin texted to say they felt they weren't as bad as others were, but they were up to no income for 12 months, at least $60,000 in repairs. Chris said he's still shocked to drive past houses to see people living in their front yards in a camper trailer, and he worries about the upcoming winter.
Yes, look, firstly, the rollout is problematic, and just as Steve's pointed out, losing your computer, you may not be that computer savvy anyway, and that's why the recovery centres have been set up. And you can go to the recovery centres and you can have somebody there put in the information on a computer for you. There is help at the recovery centres. We'd all love it to be rolled out a lot faster, but I guess staffing shortages as well is another thing. Is there enough staff out there to help with this recovery effort? I would imagine that's probably part of the problem, and accommodation for people in our area as well, because accommodation is a problem, as we've heard from Dion, with people trying to be accommodated. Thankfully, we've got the pods rolling out this week, and Ballina Shire is the first to be rolled out. That temporary accommodation, which is great, and it should be the first also. First priority is rolling that out. But with the funding allocations, there is a process that has to be followed, and it, as Steve said too, it's about ticking boxes and making sure that everything's compliant.
But isn't that when a disaster really calls? It's like calling for an emergency situation, right? Things need to happen quickly because there are lives on the line. Isn't that a point where the bureaucracy should streamline effectively, dramatically, quickly?
Well, we saw that in the first rollout.
You think you saw that?
Automatically. Every adult got $1,000 and every eligible child got $400. We saw the second rollout of $2,000 to every, another 2 weeks' payments to every adult and $800 to every child. That was an immediate rollout, which was very welcome.
Yeah, so Brett,
no, I was just going to say, I mean, I think we've been prepared, we should have been prepared for this over many years now. You know, there's been report after report about the vulnerability in the community, about the lack of preparedness, about the underfunding of mitigation strategies. All of this has been in place, and yes, it's great that $1,000 has come through, but where does $1,000 go when you need to buy a bed and or if you're an Indigenous person and you've lost access to land? I mean, and I think that, in my current role at Access Now, I've been involved in many disaster responses, whether it be related to political or environmental, and the bureaucracy has to step to the side. Like, we have to, if the money is in the bank from the government or from the different departments, the main objective is to get the money from that bank account to that bank account, or that service to the person in need.
Where have you seen that happen in the right way?
That's a good question. I mean, I actually have never seen it done brilliantly. I know when I was in Coracai the other day, like, you could see, volunteering in a very small way compared to some of the volunteering activities that people have been engaged in. But you could see, like a whole car park full of tanks and trucks and a whole tent full of bottled water. But when you go around the street and speak to people, and they're like, they don't have any of that water. They don't have any of, or there's like 400 tins of beans, that don't necessarily relate to what the need of the community is. And I think going forward, because we need to go forward and we need to think constructively, is how do we recognise that this is not the last flood? Unfortunately, this is not the last fire. We're in climate change breakdown crisis at the moment, and we need to streamline all of the systems in anticipation of these things coming and happening again, and perhaps worse.
Dion, can you tell us, what happened in your community? You have such a pivotal role as the principal of the school there. There's so many people that I'm sure that have come to you for advice and sought your leadership on this. Can you tell us what happened on Cabbage Tree Island and what happened to the school?
So, on the Monday, our community was actually evacuated. I think that was the 28th of February. And our community on the ground were hoping that the island was going to be okay. Had been through many floods, But I think once everyone saw what was happening in Lismore on Ballina Road, tears started to stream. Everyone knew that it wasn't going to be a great outcome further down. And I do know that we had Jarlee Aboriginal Land Council, we had Community Transport who came in and were assisting in evacuating people off the island. There was a very short time frame to be able to get people off. We've got one way on, one way off the island. And certainly, you know, when you've got elders, you've got community members who are fragile, who are unwell, you know, it's a really big deal to be taken from your home and not knowing where you're going to end up, for how long. And there was a bit of resistance and concern. So, you know, if it wasn't for the local community on the ground, I'm fearful of what might have happened within our community around the safety of elderly people. You know, talking about processes, I know that when our community was evacuated and taken into Ballina, our community was taken to a whole range of different locations. And there were people who were split up from carers and other family members. No, you can't go there. It took hours to have people registered to find a home, over a temporary accommodation, even for overnight. And that just wasn't okay. When people were already dealing with a crisis, the processes just weren't adequate. We had 190 people from our community where we should be able to be together and look at how we can put support structures in place to make sure they're already in trauma, dealing with a crisis. Let's not traumatise more by having unnecessary paperwork to make sure that someone has a bed, you know, a roof over their head. There are ways that we need to do it better. And I'm hearing stories from our community where, you know, people, single mums, families are lining up for 2 hours. I know they've received the $1,000 relief funding. $1,000 does not go very far at all. We're talking about families who've been displaced for 6, 7, 8 weeks. And they're lining up for 2 hours to find that by the time they get to the front of the line, oh, sorry, there's no funding available. Which funding are we talking about? There's so much confusion around all the different funding sources. It changes from week to week. And our community's just not trusting the system, in that you put time and effort to look to see what support's in place and then you're let down. Why am I going to go back and deal with that and relive that experience over and over again? And there's a sense that there are people who are genuine in need of support who are being questioned so severely, it's not worth the interrogation and the scrutiny of what they have to deal with.
So much additional stress to go through the process. I just want to bring Sharon in, because I know you were wanting to jump in before.
I'd just like to... I was at the evacuation centre when Cabbage Tree Island was evacuated at the Richmond Room, and there were animals coming through as well. Yes. Chris Binge was fantastic, the way we had an elderly resident that didn't want to leave without her dogs, and he went back and he assisted her in leaving there. But we had community and justice there going through the process of getting accommodation. Everybody did have to be registered because we had to know where they were and who was where they were. So we did, at the end of everybody that the motels were full, we then had to look at alternate accommodation. So I rang the local government minister, Wendy Tuckerman, and asked her to help. We still had 70 residents unable to be housed in motels. So she actually brought on the state government facility at Lennox Head, and I was very grateful for that because we were able to put everybody together. And so I believe that we were doing as much as we possibly could.
It still sounds like there's room
to try and bring everybody together.
I think it's very important that we take time to actually go back and listen and take a moment to really reflect on what could be improved upon. Some of the temporary accommodation was of concern as well for our families. We had elders and we had families with little children. Where they were staying, they felt unsafe. There were additional people who had been housed there temporarily as well. And I know that our community didn't want to leave their rooms because they felt unsafe in some of the locations, and then they were then relocated again. I've got families who have been relocated 5, 6 times over the last few weeks with 5, 6, 7 children. And who needs that? I know it's not their fault, and I'm not blaming the people on the ground, but there are ways that we need to streamline processes so that it is less traumatic, and we are really looking at the compassion of how we deal with people who are in crisis. And I would also stress that there needs to be a bigger conversation around the vulnerabilities of difference in our community. So I know that around flood relief, around some of the supports in place, what's been happening for the non-Aboriginal community and what's been happening for the Aboriginal community, they are not aligning. The mismatch is very concerning in that you don't treat one group of people this way and then you treat the other group that way. You have choice, you don't. If there's an event that's happened and there's been concern about behaviour within locations, who does the finger get pointed to? The Aboriginal community, and it has been wrongfully done so. So there are all these other added stresses which are causing great concern and trauma on trauma. So if we can get these processes in place around flood relief, I know that that's going to benefit community.
And I've got to say, Dion, sorry, it highlights to me the scale and the magnitude of the disaster that we're living through, in the fact that there's no quick fix to this. You can't be evacuated one day and expect to be back in your home in the next week or two, because we're looking at years for a community like Cabbage Tree to be rebuilt.
Steve, can I just ask you very quickly, because I need to move on, but just the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation, how much of a hope is it that this will be a pivot point? This will be a moment where things can change and be better coordinated?
Well, the hope is that it will cut through a lot of this red tape that everyone seems to be talking about and dealing with, to have one central organisation coordinating what seems, while you're living through it, the dozens of different groups that you have to appeal to and beg for assistance from. Hopefully this corporation is the one organisation that is the coordinating body of that. People who have lost their home or have lost their business or who have been relocated can contact and get certainty.
One point to go to. Okay. Look, as we've been hearing, the response from locals to government support has been decidedly mixed. And we know that when the floods first hit back in February, both the federal and state governments copped flack for the speed in which emergency responders were mobilised. Back then, the community stepped in, and in many cases, they haven't stopped, with volunteers working around the clock to keep flood-affected residents fed, sheltered and supported. Reporter Stephanie Bolchi was in Lismore to meet some of the community support groups to see how they're going.
On February 28, Lismore residents stepped up to save strangers from the torrent of water engulfing their community.
There's someone being rescued right now, actually. We'll just pan over. This is the sort of community spirit that we've been seeing here throughout all day, hours and hours on end. Volunteers and authorities have been going back and forth on boats, rescuing people that have been stuck at their submerged homes from all hours of the night.
After the flood waters subsided, the streets were buzzing with workers. Now, 2 months on, much of the debris has gone, but the work hasn't. It's clear, though, the heart of this community hasn't been lost, reinforced by the donated banners strung up across affected businesses and homes. With a lack of skilled tradies, owners are having to do the work themselves, or are turning to organisations like Resilient Lismore that was set up after the last big flood in 2017. Here they coordinate volunteers, connecting the community through social media, but also offering free cleaning products and tools.
The government has put forward lots of money. We appreciate that, but right now we need that factored in to be also people power and actual workers to come as well.
Organisers at this charity say that they need more than 700 skilled labourers to fill just the 500 jobs they already have on their books.
Lucas and Tobin have travelled from Melbourne and Coffs to help out.
Helping people secure their houses is the big priority, like lock their front and back doors, fix up their windows, just to help them be a bit more secure.
I'm an arborist. I mean, there's lots of flood. When you have water and wind and rain, trees lose limbs, they lose structure, they fall over. There's definitely an element that I'm willing to help with that, but also just basic help as well.
Sarah has been volunteering at the hub for about 6 weeks, trying to coordinate the assistance.
We have the ability to help, we have an amazing system in place that we're using, but not the right people to be helping. It does hurt.
And still, a month after the second major flood, securing enough food is proving difficult for a lot of people.
This is one of the community kitchens set up after the floods 2 months ago. Since then, they've served up about 100,000 meals and the need hasn't gone away. In fact, the Koori Kitchen volunteers are seeing families who hadn't come before.
We're actually seeing more of the community come in because a lot of people were staying with family or had to live, with friends, but are now kind of 6, 7 weeks, 8 weeks coming back into their houses. The production-wise has grown, like we're doing over 1,000 meals a day.
Without running water and electricity, many locals are turning to the Koori Kitchen for a bite to eat and a chat.
Every day someone comes here and they just grab you and say, I just want to say thank you. Maybe they haven't had a hot meal for 2 days because they've been cleaning and they forget to eat.
Steve, some really astonishing stories there about community support. And we keep hearing about how people returning to Lismore, but there's no running water, no electricity, and they're continuing to need to have meals and that kind of support. How long do you think that's going to go on for?
I'm hoping, I know that there's running water now. We had major infrastructure, and we've got infrastructure problems that are going to confront us for the next 12 to 18 months. There's no question about that. But, getting the basic needs, the water, I know Essential Energy have done an outstanding job to restore power I thought Easter was their deadline to try and even get the CBD back up and running as far as electricity goes. Problem now is that buildings have electricity, now they have to be certified by an electrician.
Right.
And as we've all heard, there's a real tradie shortage. So getting those level 2 electricians to come in and certify your home and reconnect the power properly is really the hold up. And the scale, as I keep saying, the scale and magnitude of what we're living through is enormous, and thousands upon thousands of homes, businesses that are living off one PowerPoint until they get that certification.
Right, and we drive along the streets of Lismore and you'll see somewhere that's boarded up and empty. Looks like the structure's in place, but inside we know how much damage has been and how much rebuilding of things like electricity. Now, we've seen the stories of the volunteers, Sharon, from the very beginning, and I know that you've still hearing stories of people that were out rescuing others for hours and hours and going for days without sleep, looking after other people. It also makes it hard with this kind of community. It's really bonded people together at a time when, as we know, we're about to talk about Twitter, there's so much polarisation and division culturally. To have moments when a community comes together is really powerful. Does that make it then difficult to have conversations about, do we need to relocate? Do we need to rebuild in a different way? Should a CBD be off the floodplains? But are they the conversations we need to be having?
Well, relocating, particularly for Lismore, is a matter for Lismore, not for me and Ballina, but predominantly the communities right around the Northern Rivers have shone brightly. As leaders of the community, I'm sure all our mayors could not be prouder than what has happened, how it's been community supporting community, and it goes on. There's fatigue out there. There's lots of people going over and above, still doing things. Only yesterday I heard of someone that wants to remain anonymous. Initially, I set up a volunteer effort in the very early days of the disaster, and what we were doing was door knocking to see what people needed, and then another team would go out and provide what they needed. And I heard that one of the volunteers is still working with someone who is providing white goods for people anonymously. There's so much activity going on out there. We see all the flood rescues in Lismore. We had those same boat rescues in Ballina Shire, and it was only last week I heard of someone that was rescuing boats, people from Pimlico into Wardell, into the evacuation centre there. So a lot of
tough questions about the rebuild, about a vision for what the future looks like in terms of vegetation or rewilding, or different housing developments, different planning and mitigation and adaptation.
Right, well, the Reconstruction Corporation, I think, is a really good step forward. Whilst we've got 7 committees that sit underneath that Reconstruction Committee, they all deal with separate things like land contamination, health and well-being, infrastructure.
But your view about any of those policies?
Absolutely. Well, they're all specialist areas which need to be dealt with individually. The Reconstruction Corporation will sit over the top of that and have cut through with red tape. It will have cut through with planning, whatever it takes, whatever needs to be done to activate things happening quickly. Be that getting people back to their homes, rebuilding their homes, social housing.
I just want to bring Stephen as well, because we were just talking about Lismore CBD. Now, you're not in favour of it being relocated, is that right?
Oh no, but I'm stubborn. And
Tell us why. Would it save a lot of heartache? Were tough decisions like that made?
I think you've got to look at it a little bit holistically as well. I keep harping on that 28th of February was a natural disaster. Lismore's designed around a floodplain because we are on a floodplain. We can deal with flooding. Most people can deal with a 12-metre flood, which is higher than the previous recorded height. What we got was a monster of 14.37 metres. And to take an isolated flood event like that, and I know what people will say, well, it's climate change and all of this sort of thing, expect more and bigger.
Right.
I accept the science of climate change, but I also...
But you wouldn't use the word isolated then if you're
Lismore
talking
is
about
the most
climate
flooded
change.
town in Australia, and that's a fact. And we can deal with floods. If this was a standard 10.5 metre, 11 metre flood, Cabbage Tree would be safe. Ballina wouldn't have got inundated, and Lismore would be back up and running as if nothing had happened.
That didn't happen.
I know it didn't happen.
Brett, I
think we need to think, 21st century thinking, which is like the unexpected is now to be expected. The 14.5, the 16.5 metre, whatever. I also just wanted to... And that provides us with an opportunity to revision. There's people like Mark Swivel in Byron Council who's just been issuing essays on how do we think about solar panels, how do we think about community gardens, how do we think about stormwater drainage, how do we think about public transport, how do we think about CBDs perhaps being put in the wrong location, and to bring it back to Bundjalung Nation, where Bundjalung Nation people were, shipped off to be relocated over in places where they, didn't necessarily know the person who was living next door and separated at the wrong time. We need to come back, I think, also to Indigenous knowledge, which is about, how do we live with the land? There's highways that go through wetlands. Right now, there's 2 major proposals that have been passed in Byron West, which are on wetlands, and there's like major high-density living that's being proposed there. The community said no. The council said no. It went to the Land and Environment Court and they said, yes, it was in the interest of the people. So I think that there's an opportunity now to really rethink the way that we relate to land, the way that we communicate to each other, the way that, through Twitter and other mechanisms, which we'll talk about later, but the way in which we actually cohabitate. And I think Indigenous learning and Indigenous people need to be at the centre.
What would Indigenous learning be in terms of living with a flood environment? Because these are, again, like weather patterns we haven't necessarily experienced before and we won't be able to predict.
So I suppose they're bigger conversations. First of all, I'm pleased that we can have a conversation to acknowledge the strength and significance of thousands and thousands of years of experience around Indigenous knowledges. It's not a conversation that we often have. And it's one that should be led by Aboriginal people. So, you know, I know that there are some amazing examples of what those strengths look like. And for Cabbage Tree Island, we need to be considering, you know, what that could look like for us to be flood safe. Doesn't mean that we would be flood free, but we need to be looking at a whole range of different ways. And I know that conversation has already started with, that's being led by Jarlee Aboriginal Land Council around what some of that would need to look like on Cabbage Tree Island, around how we would reuse some of the land, how we would have to relocate places to a whole range of other different areas. But, you know, they're just the conversations that have begun. But I totally agree that these are conversations we need to make the space, but they need to be led by Aboriginal people. And it's not just Indigenous knowledges around climate change or around what our local environment needs to look like. They're bigger conversations that we need to be having in education as well. So that, you know, we're really valuing and acknowledging our First Nations expertise.
Well, tell us about your community, because you're not going to be able to be living on the island for some time, right? Because all the rebuilding that needs to occur. What's been happening in terms of finding a place where people can live together and stay together?
In regards to accommodation,
or the relocation of the school,
and
those kinds of things, yeah.
So it's all fragmented. We have community members who are staying in a whole range of different locations. Our school is now temporarily located at Southern Cross Distance Ed. So I'm very pleased that I'm actually on site and supported by another Aboriginal principal. You know, that cultural safety is especially important at this time. We have the alternative pathways of distance ed, unfortunately, for a number of our children who don't seem to excel within the mainstream. And it's not that our children aren't the right fit, it's that we need to look at systems and institutions and structures that actually take into consideration the strengths of our children. So it was just a really good fit.
You've had meetings this week, haven't you? About...
So we've had our parent and community meeting, and lots of other community members came, as well as our parents and carers. And it was to be an hour meeting, which turned into 2.5 hours, which would have probably been a 6-hour meeting, just because we needed to be together. And that was the true sense of what was coming out of the conversations. We set circles, so it was about healing. It was an opportunity for everyone to come together. And I just set up and facilitated conversations so that people felt safe. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to hear about the struggles and what people are dealing with, and knowing that what was just needed and necessary was a space to stay connected, to be together, because we've got people spread out all over. We've got children who are crying, who want to be back home. We've got children who are not sleeping in their own beds, who are turning up to a huge, enormous school. That's very welcoming for us, but it's just not Cabo. So, you know, when I hear the mental health from our community, people are struggling big time. And I'm very concerned about the possibility of suicide when you are displaced, when you just feel helpless. I know that talking with our community, that I've got parents and community members who are saying, it just feels like the old days. We've got no control over our lives. and it's really disturbing that we've got a resilient community, no doubt, but there are others who just are struggling day to day.
What makes meetings like that so important, as you were describing before. Started off in tears, then you ended up laughing together.
And we had
it's just
the best laugh. Yeah, so that's all part of healing.
Right.
And we're going to continue to do that on a regular basis because we need to, and that's come from listening to community.
Another community that some people do or do not listen to is on Twitter. I really want to end today by talking about the fact that tech billionaire Elon Musk has clinched a deal to buy Twitter for 61 billion Australian dollars. The transaction will make the company private and shift control of the social media platform, populated by millions of users, to the world's richest person. Now, this is a big moment for one of the world's most influential public squares and has raised questions about wealth, media power and about free speech.
This deal is dangerous for our democracy. Billionaires like Elon Musk play by a different set of rules than everyone else, accumulating power for their own gain. We need a wealth tax and strong rules to hold big tech accountable.
But Musk himself cites free speech as the reason for his purchase, having previously complained about Twitter's moderation of posts it deemed hateful or disinformation. It's a view which has found significant support among conservative voices.
Is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter a good thing? Yes. No, I hate free speech.
Brett Solomon, thank goodness you're here. Okay, the richest man in the world, a massive platform like Twitter, what could possibly go wrong? What's this going to mean?
I mean, it is, you know, following on from this discussion here, which has been very local, but also have global implications, of course, with climate change. This is a global discussion that is also going to have a global development that's going to have such significant implications. I think not everybody uses Twitter, so that's fair. There's about 300 million people who are using Twitter in varying degrees right now, but it's really that much of the political narrative, the global debate, the discussions at council, things that define the public policy happen on Twitter. And so it's such an important part of contemporary life and how our societies are developed, geopolitics, the future of the US election, like the list goes on and on. So when you have a private person who owns the tech platform, it raises very serious questions about governance. Like how is this town hall square, which you kind of indicated, it's the new square, how is it going to be governed? And we know from Elon Musk that he has a very poor track record, both in terms of corporate governance, but also his position on freedom of speech. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think many of us who've worked in the tech space and at the intersection of tech and human rights have cautioned for many years about the role of the corporate tech sector. When it's in public hands, it makes it just that little bit better. When it's a unilateral decision owned by one particular person who has that track record, there will be very serious consequences. And I can talk about, you know, some of them, including the issue of freedom of speech.
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of if there are no controls. Obviously, globally we're moving to more regulation or attempts at regulation of these kinds of platforms. What would you envisage happening?
I mean, we've seen what happens. Actually, Twitter started in that position, and many of the tech companies did, where they, you know, it was sort of like a Wild West, where there was, you know, tech solutionism was going to answer many of the world's ills. In fact, you know, just a few years later, we saw what we've been calling social media genocide that happened in Myanmar to one of our neighbours in Burma, whereby social media, which was unregulated in the country, ended up being a place for incitement to violence and incitement to genocide. And we saw 700,000 people, talking about relocation, crossing borders in order to escape the hate of the dominant population. I think that we know what happens when we have an under-regulated or under-managed space. Twitter right now has community standards. It has a trust and safety team. It has a content governance team, which are doing the best that they can do. And in fact, Twitter's done much better than some of the other platforms on exactly this issue. We know that Elon Musk has a history of silencing his opponents, so he will have access to all of the information and data of all of the people who are on the platform. including those who he is opposed to. And in the absence of internal corporate standards and external regulation, it's a very, very worrying, deeply worrying moment that we're in right now.
Tell us about the fact that you want some human rights assessment done of this purchase. Is that even possible?
Yeah, well, many of us in this area have worked for over the last 10 years to try and bring human rights standards to tech companies. It's absolutely essential that the tech sector understands that it has massive human rights implications. I mean, we've seen just with the pandemic, it's not just about right to freedom of expression and opinion, but it's about right to healthcare, about right to education, about right to a livelihood. All of these things happen in the online environment. And so we have had some success, quite a lot of success at trying to bring the human rights framework online, trying to train the tech companies to understand the human rights implications of their platforms, and to have policies and practices that are in place in order to limit the negative impacts and promote the positive ones. And so with respect to the purchase and the sale, we have of this platform, we have a whole range of investors who are providing the money. We have a board within the platform. We have Twitter employees, and they are all leveraging points to call for this human rights impact standard or assessment to take place, and then for it to be public, transparent, and then acted upon.
Steve, what would you do with $61 billion?
I could rebuild a city.
Right, and then some.
Pretty easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? Having
that
kind of finance, especially when we're talking about what $1,000 what difference that can make in someone's life.
Yeah, but through whatever means he's used, he's made that money, and I'm sure he's got the right to spend it how he wishes. And as we've seen, he wants to venture to space and do all sorts of things. And at the moment, I didn't even know about the purchase until I was in the car talking to your people about it.
Yeah,
I've got other things on my mind.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. But I think the thing is that it's not just about him being a rich man and therefore can decide how he spends it. It has such significant consequences for the world. Like if we look, if Musk decides to allow Trump back on the platform, it could influence who is the President of the United States.
Tell us why. For people who aren't Twitter, there's a lot of people who aren't
sorry.
Twitter.
Well, that's what I was saying, is you don't need to be part of on the platform. But the thing is that, Trump has around, I think, 80 million...
80-something,
80 million followers. He's able to communicate directly with his followers, spreading false news, the big lie, for example, that the election... The insurrection, all of this happened on a lot of this happened on the Twitter platform. And so Trump has tried to set up his own platform, and so far unsuccessfully. I think that, when you think about the most important election in the world and the most influential person in the world, probably, it's the President of the United States. But it may well be the owner of Twitter. And I think that's the interesting thing for Musk, is that he's now the richest man, and it is a deft move to buy Twitter because he knows that he can become the most powerful man in the world by owning that platform where much of that debate and discussion happens.
Sharon.
Isn't that scary? To just think about that we are controlled by a social media platform. We are controlled in our decision-making.
In ways we don't even fully understand a lot of the time.
I just think that is such a scary thing, and we see that playing out all the time.
But does it go back to the initial discussion we're having in this show about distrust of major parties and of systems of governance and things not getting done and incompetence, and into that vacuum can come all kinds of theories? I know you're very wary about Twitter, Dion.
Yeah, and I think it just reinforces that imbalance of power. Who has the voice, who doesn't? I'm not a regular user of Twitter, distorts the truth, and that, is just something that I probably need to delve in a bit deeper to have some influence within that space. But just concerned about who has control and who doesn't have a voice. And, we continue to have those rich, eccentric people ruling and making big decisions that impact us all. And as First Nations people, we have very little impact on that. That imbalance of power is very, very concerning.
And the thing is, if we all got off Twitter, it wouldn't exist anymore. It needs its users more than anything. All right, unfortunately. Yeah, I'll go first. Okay, I am on Twitter. Is all we have time for tonight. I want to thank our panel, Dion Anderson, Brett Solomon, Sharon Cadwallader and Steve Krieg. Thanks so much, all. Such a delight to have you. We're going to have Ellen back with you tomorrow. I hope you have an excellent evening. Enjoy the view. Good night.
It's on.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
WA's COVID mask mandate to end on Thursday night as the Omicron peak passes. Labor unveils its plan for the Pacific, more money for aid and the ABC. Former WA Treasurer Troy Buswell gets a suspended jail term for assaulting his ex-wife.
And coming up on The Business, a bird's-eye view of Melbourne's key marginal seats and the votes that could swing the election.
This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Tyne Logan. Western Australia's indoor mask mandate will lift at midnight on Thursday, along with a suite of other COVID restrictions. The Premier is calling it WA's new baseline settings, which he says is only achievable due to the state's third dose vaccination rate of 79%. The Chief Health Officer says while many cases may rise, it's the right time to wind back restrictions.
Masks and when they'll come off has been the topic, quite literally, on everybody's lips. Now we have an answer. The mandate will lift on Friday.
But I would note, it's only the mandate that is going. If you still want to wear a mask in certain settings, you absolutely can.
I want to reassure all West Australians we've done this based upon the best of medical advice.
Some couldn't hide their smiles and, within days, will no longer have to.
I think it's marvellous. Going to be wonderful.
I'm actually quite happy. Well, only because I've got to work with one on and it gets really busy and really hot.
School will be good to go back without one.
It's just going to be better to be able to see more of people's faces again, you know, rather than just always just seeing people's eyes. More facial expression and everything is always nice.
Also being scrapped are capacity limits. Stadiums and theatres can fill once more. And there'll be no 2 square metre rule for venues.
It's no exaggeration to say this is the best news that WA's hospitality industry's had in the last 2 years.
The only place you will still need to wear a mask is in taxis and rideshare, on public transport, prisons and airports, aged and disability care and hospitals. Healthcare settings will also soon be the only place requiring proof of vaccination on entry. While the vaccine mandate for certain jobs will remain, proof of vax no longer needs to be shown at hospitality venues. The Health Minister says with our high vax rate, it's time to take the burden off business owners. The G2G system is also being scrapped because interstate travellers no longer need to be vaxxed. But the Commonwealth's double dose requirement on international arrivals remains. There will also be a major change to the close contact rules. From Friday, someone who's a close contact, even if they live with an infected person, will only need to isolate if and when they develop symptoms. But they'll need to follow a few rules. These include taking a daily rapid antigen test, wearing a mask whenever they leave home, avoiding high-risk settings, and they must notify their employer and work from home wherever possible.
For example, if your partner is sick at home with COVID, you can leave to go to the shops wearing a mask, but you shouldn't go to a nightclub or visit an elderly relative.
The Chief Health Officer says the changes may result in higher cases and more children missing school, along with potential shortages of critical workers, but says the timing is right. James Carmody, ABC News.
China's sudden security incursion into Solomon Islands has prompted Labor to step forward with its own plan for the Pacific. The package of foreign aid, defence training and extra Australian broadcasting is meant to counter what it calls the biggest security blunder by this country since World War II. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
When being Prime Minister requires a soft touch.
A bit delicate.
They are very delicate, aren't they?
But if you think making macarons is difficult,
there we go.
Healing relations with a Macron will be trickier.
I wish him every congratulations for what is an historic victory for President Macron.
Hello, how are you? Andrew Probyn from the ABC. The re-elected French president who had a spectacular falling out with Scott Morrison over a cancelled submarine contract.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know. Will be critical in a coordinated response to Beijing's influence in the Indo-Pacific, where France has more than 1 million citizens. China's striking of a military pact with the Solomons of major embarrassment to Scott Morrison's so-called Pacific step-up.
The bloke who just keeps dropping the ball, the bloke who went missing while China negotiated and signed a security deal on our doorstep.
Labor revealing the approach it would take to make Australia the Pacific partner of choice. An extra $500 million in aid over 4 years, 3,000 permanent migration spots for Pacific Islanders, allowing seasonal workers to bring their families, financing climate and clean energy projects and extending the reach of ABC broadcasts.
I sent in the AFP. The Labor Party wants to send in the ABC. They have a Q&A solution in the Pacific.
Although the PM is refusing to say what he would do if the Chinese established a military base on the Solomons, which he said on the weekend was a red line.
No responsible Prime Minister would go into the sort of detail that you're asking for.
No point in beating your chest if you're beaten to the punch.
Where's that coming from?
On climate, the coalition's accused of sending conflicting messages to rural and city constituents. Queensland Senator Matt Canavan dismissing the government's net zero emissions plan.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway.
Its candidate in the Queensland seat of Flynn describing the government's net zero emissions by 2050 commitment as flexible.
Our candidate in Flynn was talking about is how we get there. He wasn't talking about the commitment himself.
Labor too having to explain how coal production won't be affected by its push to penalise major emitters.
No coal project will face a carbon constraint that is beyond, that will make them internationally uncompetitive.
Scott Morrison's embrace of net zero by 2050 constrains coalition attacks on Labor over climate change. And the Beijing blindside in the Solomons also blunts any government boast on national security. Not that this is stopping them. The PM and his ministers continue to talk tough on China. But if the government's rhetoric was matched by actual defence capability, Australia would have one of the world's strongest militaries. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
The divide over climate change policy hurt Labor last election. This time around, both parties are struggling to overcome internal disagreements. Here's data analyst Casey Briggs.
When it comes to staying on message on coal and climate change, the coalition's got some problems. This is Colin Boyce. He's the LNP's candidate for the regional Queensland seat of Flynn.
Zero net carbon emissions by 2050. Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room.
The coalition's division goes all the way to the top. The PM and the Nationals' deputy leader talking completely at odds.
Our commitment to net zero by 2050 is a commitment of the Australian government that I made in Glasgow. It is the government's absolute policy.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson's said he's pausing the net zero commitment. Germany's building coal and gas infrastructure. Italy's reopening coal-fired power plants. It's all over.
The seat Colin Boyce is trying to win is home to about a tenth of all of Australia's coal mining jobs. And this is a part of the country that Labor had deep troubles in 3 years ago. Remember the Stop Adani convoy? Didn't really do any favours for Labor in this seat. And so this time the opposition's trying not to repeat some of those same mistakes. Here is its candidate for Flynn in 2022.
They wouldn't say coal. That was the issue. I will say it, and I'll say it every day.
But head 1,600 kilometres south, where Labor's more worried about losing votes to the left than it is to the right, and there, the message is pretty different. This is Labor's candidate for Melbourne talking about higher renewable energy targets. And here's MP for McNamara, Josh Burns, talking about a quick transition away from fossil fuels. So Labor still has seats where that climate coal messaging is butting heads in different parts of the country. What's new, though, is that the Coalition have some of those seats as well, defending ones in regional Queensland and some of these inner city seats, seats like Wentworth and seats like North Sydney, where the candidates are posting messages like this online in support of the net zero target. It's a big country. These are broad churches of political parties, and sometimes that makes staying on message hard.
A landmark wages case has begun that could leave aged care workers significantly better off. The Health Services Union is asking the Fair Work Commission to raise the wages of those who care for some of the country's most vulnerable people.
The Health Services Union is making its pitch.
It is now time to make sure we can attract and we can retain good people in aged care to support our most vulnerable.
The Fair Work Commission is considering its application to boost wages by 25%. If successful, that would bring the hourly rate for entry-level workers up from about $22 to about $29. It's a change that would affect more than 200,000 people.
It's actually a highly skilled job, but it's paid as if it was a menial job.
An increase in award wages was a key recommendation of the Aged Care Royal Commission as a way to attract and retain properly skilled staff.
Since November 2020, over 100 statements have been filed in this matter, and we've had a significant number of submissions from employers in support of the HSU's application, and that's really important.
Today, opposition leader Anthony Albanese said a Labor government would recruit doctors and nurses from overseas as a stopgap measure to fulfil its promise to provide around-the-clock care in residential settings. That's despite an earlier promise to focus on recruiting Australians.
Skilled migration has a role to play in filling legitimate skills shortages. It always has and it always will.
In February, the federal government announced 2 one-off payments of up to $400 to workers to prevent a mass exodus from the industry. It says it will honour the Fair Work decision, but hasn't promised to fund it.
The Commission will hear from witnesses over 5 weeks into July, and a decision isn't expected until the end of this year or early next year.
Proceedings will continue at the Commission tomorrow. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
Former WA Liberal leader and Treasurer Troy Buswell has avoided being sent to jail for 3 assaults on his ex-wife. His admission of guilt came midway through his trial, but the magistrate accepted Mr Buswell had rehabilitated himself.
Troy Buswell was once one of WA's most powerful people. Now,
Mr Buswell,
he's a convicted wife beater.
Mr Buswell, are you feeling lucky to avoid going to jail today?
On 3 occasions in 2015 and 2016, he assaulted Melissa Hankinson, with whom he'd been in a relationship since late 2014. The first assault involved him pushing her down a step and prodding her with a broom, while the second was on Valentine's Day in 2016, when he smacked her with a spoon. The third and final assault was a month before their wedding. Buswell pushed Miss Hankinson in the face, and as she lay on the ground, he repeatedly kicked her.
Anything you want to say to your ex-wife? Do you want to apologise to your ex-wife, Mr Buswell?
Prosecutor Sean Dworkin described the offences as cowardly and brazen and said they'd had a significant impact on Ms Hankinson, who felt ashamed because she was a police officer but not reporting what was happening to her. However, Buswell's lawyer Tom Percy said the offences happened in the context of a troubled relationship, which included what he called a degree of physicality by both parties.
Mr Buswell, are you a violent man?
Magistrate Evan Shackleton accepted that Buswell had undertaken steps to rehabilitate himself, including no longer drinking alcohol and being compliant with his medication for bipolar disorder. However, he said the assaults were serious, particularly the last one, and a term of imprisonment was required. He imposed an 8.5-month prison sentence, but suspended it for 12 months. Buswell was also fined $2,500, with an order it be paid to Ms Hankinson. Joanna Manar, ABC News.
West Coast midfielder Tim Kelly says his side risks being labelled as a soft target as it continues to deal with injury and COVID concerns. The Eagles are coming off big back-to-back losses at home and away and have just one win from the opening 6 rounds. A loss against the Tigers would see the side record its worst start to the season since 2008. Kelly says the players can't hide from their poor form.
You know, we're probably getting looked at right now as a bit of an easy target. So, you know, it's on us to be able to change that narrative and how we're, you know, perceived by other clubs. So, we get a chance to do that this week.
Andrew Gaff is expected to return for the Eagles after missing the past 3 games with an ankle injury. Around the country tomorrow, partly cloudy in Adelaide with a top of 23 and cloudy in Melbourne with a top of 22. Showers in Sydney, Perth and a few showers for Hobart, Canberra and Brisbane. And that's ABC Late News. I'm Tyne Logan. Thank you for your company. Stay with us for the business.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, a bird's eye view of Melbourne's key marginal seats and the votes that could swing the election.
I think the big problem is the economy. Everybody's scared.
Climate change is a huge issue across the board. People want to see action.
And putting a rocket up social media. Why the world's richest man is splashing out $61 billion on Twitter.
We're pretty confident that you're going to look back in 5 or 10 years' time and say, OK, he made all that noise about free speech, but he's also ended up with a very valuable asset.
It's the 3rd week of the election campaign, and tonight we canvass businesses and workers in the marginal seats of Melbourne. In these electorates, the coalition faces tough competition from Labor, climate-focused independents and the Greens, as voters demand action on everything from the environment to cost of living and the post-pandemic recovery. Nassim Hadem reports.
Melbourne's election battlegrounds. The competition and campaign tactics are getting fierce. Chisholm, Higgins, Goldstein and Kooyong. These are key seats that could change the outcome of who wins at the polls on May 21.
I'm here in Melbourne's eastern suburb of Box Hill. It's in the electorate of Chisholm, which is one of the most marginal seats in the country, held by just 0.5%.
Liberal Gladys Liu is up against union official Labor's Karina Garland. Anti-government sentiment over Australia-China trade relations is threatening Miss Liu's campaign.
There is that element of what we use the term China bashing and racism, and that has impacted on the Chinese/Asian Australian community, and the impact of that government rhetoric will impact on the vote of a younger generation of Chinese Australians.
The seat of Chisholm is one of the country's most diverse. More than 50% of people here were born overseas, with about 15% coming from China. But it's not just Australia-China tensions that matter to voters here. Key economic issues will also influence how they vote.
Waitress Joyce Kwan says housing affordability is also a big issue.
I know that in the future it's probably a little bit harder for me to even think about purchasing somewhere around the area or even close to Melbourne.
The 18-year-old also wants action to reduce carbon emissions.
More climate change policies in regards to cutting down fossil fuels, because there's only so much you can do as an individual to stop it.
The seat of Higgins, which takes in Melbourne's inner southeastern suburbs, is currently held by Liberal Katie Allen with a margin of 2.6%. Over the years, Liberal support here has been diminishing. If the party's first preference vote declines further, the electorate could be lost to Labor or the Greens. Business groups want investment in skills. They say with interest rates set to rise and cost of living issues compounding, people need secure and well-paid jobs.
Ensuring that they have access to sustainable long-term employment prospects, that's fundamental.
I'm here in Brighton. It's one of a number of Bayside suburbs that the electorate of Goldstein covers. And it's one of several seats held by the coalition that's being challenged by climate-focused independents. But it's not just climate change that matters to voters here. Goldstein also covers the inland suburbs of Elsternwick and Gardenvale. Traditionally a safe Liberal seat, it's held by Tim Wilson with a margin of 7.8%. But now independent candidate Zoe Daniel poses a threat. The former ABC journalist is campaigning on big issues like climate change and political integrity. Cafe owner Andrew Gelman wants policies that make running a business easier, which includes helping his become more sustainable.
Climate change is a huge issue across the board. People want to see action. The biggest difference is going to be made if the government enforces it.
Mr. Gelman also worries it's getting harder to get full-time staff in hospitality. He wants politicians to crack down on businesses that underpay workers and longer-term visas for migrants.
Maybe if migrant workers didn't have just a set amount of time, they would be looking at longer term work.
Another blue ribbon electorate, about 12 kilometres away, is Kooyong. This inner Melbourne area covers suburbs east of the CBD. Josh Frydenberg has held the seat since 2010, but there's a risk the federal treasurer could now lose it to independent Monique Ryan, who's campaigning on climate action and improved healthcare. While many voters here want action to save the environment, Hawthorn beauty therapist Maria Vlahos is more concerned about the post-pandemic recovery.
I think the big problem is the economy. Everybody's scared.
She says foot traffic is still down and wants businesses to get cash grants of up to $5,000 to help them get back on track.
Everybody's talking about normality and that it's not happening fast enough. So businesses are struggling.
The seat of Kooyong, which has existed since Federation, has always been held by the Conservative side of politics. But this year the challenge is which candidate can convince voters that a future under them is one where jobs and businesses boom.
It's the social media platform of choice for politicians, celebrities and millions of Twitterati. Now, the world's richest man, Elon Musk, is set to clinch a $61 billion deal to buy Twitter. Twitter said the offer was unanimously approved by its board, its shares jumping 6% on the news. Twitter has struggled to make a profit, but prolific tweeter Elon Musk says it's all about free speech, declaring it's not a way to make money and I don't care about the economics at all. But Musk stands to make billions, according to investment house Forager. CIO Steve Johnson says Elon Musk's commentary around the deal is as much about free speech as it is about convincing Twitter shareholders to approve the deal.
I have no doubt that he believes what he says on the free speech side of things, and he's been very vocal about that over a number of years. But I do think some of his commentary about not caring whether Twitter ever makes a profit and only doing this because of free speech is a bit of a furphy and specifically designed, I think, to convince shareholders of Twitter that they're not going to get a better offer and that this business may never actually be profitable.
Well, 200 million daily users. I mean, Twitter is fairly small by comparison with the other tech giants. Just how high do you think that Twitter's value could go, and how exactly will Musk monetize it?
Look, if you go back 10 years when Twitter first listed, it actually wasn't that different to Facebook back then. And the fact that Facebook has a market capitalisation today, even after its share price falling in half, of $500 billion US, and Twitter was sitting here before Elon Musk turned up with a market capitalisation of $30 billion, I think that tells you all you need to know about the past 10 years. We've had an extraordinary amount of largesse towards staff. Its stock-based compensation last year of $630 million. And you look at the actual Twitter platform, and anyone who uses it would say this is not really that distinguishable from what I was using 10 years ago. And anyone who's received ads on the platform knows that they are woefully untargeted in terms of things that you're actually interested in. And you know, I'm a big user of the platform, and I get ads for the weirdest things ever. And they should know so much more about what I'm interested in, being finance. So it has been really mismanaged for a long period of time. We think the board has done a very bad job. We only invested in this business in 2020 because we thought there were signs of that turning around. So, look, it shouldn't be as big as Facebook is, there's no doubt about that, but it should be a much bigger business than it is today. And I actually think it's probably the most sustainable of the social media platforms, because each new generation that comes along, the kids today don't want to be on Facebook. In fact, I've got a 21-year-old niece who's never been on Facebook in her life. Yet I think Twitter attracts a very different cohort of people, and each generation has those geeks and wonks that want to interact on Twitter. So I think, surprisingly, I think it's going to be more sustainable than some of the other social media platforms.
OK, well, the share price is still lower than the takeover offer. Does this deal represent value, in your opinion, or has Elon Musk overpaid?
Look, we are a little bit torn. This is one of the largest investments in our international shares fund. So to get a bid at a substantial premium to where the shares were trading a few months ago is welcome news on one hand. And we're in a market at the moment that is extremely volatile. So our capacity to take that money and invest it elsewhere is also fairly prospective at the moment. Look, we really do think, though, that this business is worth 70 or 80 billion US dollars, not the 50 that he's buying it for. And we're pretty confident that you're going to look back in 5 or 10 years' time and say, OK, he made all that noise about free speech, but he's also ended up with a very valuable asset here. And it's actually not complicated. I think there's some pretty simple things you can do here to take cost out of the business, to try and get that advertising algorithm to work better, and to do a lot more on the subscription side of things. So, but we think there's another 30 to 40% here, but I doubt that shareholders are going to get to see that based on what we've seen at the moment.
We hear about a lot about regulation in this space. What threat does it pose to Twitter, even if the company is privatised?
I think it's a threat to the deal going ahead, full stop. A lot of people talking today, like Elon Musk has already bought Twitter. Yes, the board has agreed to a deal and agreed to recommend that to its shareholders, but the shareholders still need to vote on this to start with. And then I think there's going to be so much regulatory and political attention on this, as there should be, to be fair, that the risks of it not going through have to be fairly meaningful. So the stock is trading at a 6 or 7% discount to that bid price at the moment. That reflects some of that risk of the deal going through. It probably reflects the potential for there to be a higher bid from someone else as well. Microsoft has been talked about as a potential purchaser of this asset, so there are other people that could come along. But today's market price is really trying to weigh up those competing things at this point in time. It's probably pretty fair, I would say, in terms of giving shareholders at the moment, if you want to take your money off the table today, avoid all of that regulatory risk, it's probably a reasonable option.
Steve Johnson, great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath.
Uber has been slapped with a $26 million fine for misleading customers using their car ride sharing app. The consumer watchdog says Uber admitted breaching consumer laws by making false or misleading statements in cancellation warning messages about Uber fare estimates. The ACCC says more than 2 million passengers were affected. To the markets now, and a negative day for the ASX and the All Ordinaries, both down more than 2%, dragged lower by resources. And the Australian dollar is buying just over 72 US cents. I spoke to Evan Lucas from InvestSmart after the market closed. Evan, not a great day on the market. Can you take us through the winners and losers?
Yeah, not a great day at all. In fact, it's the second worst day of the year in terms of what we saw. And you have to go back to early February where we saw a 2.98% decline to sort of see the same levels that we saw today. It was really around resources. And what I also need to point out before I go on, it also now means that after last Thursday, where we were within 6 points of a record all-time high, which was reached on the 13th of August last year, we've now fallen 4.5% since then. So Friday and today, we were playing catch-up also with the market being shut on Anzac Day. So that all puts it into it. You then need to look at it. The resources are where it's been led. Iron ore story is the big one in terms of where it is. We know China story is getting bigger and bigger. The rumours that Beijing is now going in to lockdown as well is putting that there. So if you look at BHP, it's down 15% in the last couple of days. Rio's down around about 14%. FMG 10%. So it is a very big resources sort of pullback, and you have seen that with the fact that if you look at the iron ore price, even coal as well, under all that kind of pressure. And the part of the reason why, until this week, Australia had been the best performing market on the planet from a developed perspective in Aussie dollar terms, is that resources story, and that reversed a little bit, and that's why we find ourselves where we are.
OK, and on to interest rates. The case for this pre-election rate rise is firming, according to some experts. What do you think?
I'm with them, and I don't even think it should be firming. It just should be a certainty. If the RBA wants to prove that it's independent and that there isn't any sort of political overlay to it, they need to move. We are not in emergency scenarios anymore. The cash rate is still at 0.1%, which is where it was put in November 2020 for COVID, for those reasons, and we are not there. So tomorrow, the CPI read is going to show that it's going to be well above the RBA's 2 to 3% target band. In our view, it's probably going to be about 4% for the first quarter and rising still further. We don't need to have, therefore, an interest rate at that level. So they should, in my eyes, possibly go along the lines of normalising policy or moving away from emergency extreme accommodation and only raising by 0.15%. Some people are saying they should go harder, maybe as much as 0.4 to bring it up to half of 1%. But to bring it to 0.25% at least would be correct. It lays the groundwork for them to be able to maybe raise rates 2 more times in 2022.
Evan Lucas, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
And that's all from The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for your company.
Hello, I'm Wendy McCarthy, mentor, writer and feminist activist. When I joined forces with the subject of tonight's Australian story to campaign on women's issues, some of my friends were surprised. Why would I want to support a billionaire philanthropist who couldn't possibly understand the needs of everyday women? For decades, Nicola Forrest has been in the shadow of her controversial husband, mining magnate Andrew Forrest. Together, Andrew and Nicola have set themselves the challenge of giving away the vast majority of their fortune in their lifetime. Nicola is stepping into the spotlight to campaign on issues she and I care about deeply.
Oh, you'll love this. It's so easy. Parmesan smells good. Have you put salt and pepper?
My son came home from school one day and said, "Mummy, what's a billionaire?"
That should be right.
I said, "You know what, sweetheart? It's all just figures in books. You know how we've got shares in Fortescue? It's not real money."
So thank you for rolling my sleeves.
But yeah, of course, now we are reaping the rewards of the dividends.
If it was too perfect, then people would think we just bought them.
We live in a beautiful home and, you know, I have a great life. But the things that are most important, money doesn't buy that. My influence being, don't waste it.
Don't waste.
So we just said, let's give the rest of it away.
And so he stood up and said, well, Andrew Forrest and I have serious track record together. The decision to give away everything but the personal things and the goods and chattels was really quite an easy decision. You know, let's not die wealthy. What's the point of that? You know, so I just thought we're having a chat. I thought we're catching up. Okay, so talk to me about you.
Children don't benefit from thinking they're going to inherit a huge amount of money. I think it's a burden.
Nicola's this little soul who fills the house. Not always with joy, but she fills it.
We were all driving, it was like a school pickup or something like that. And it was, hey kids, we're thinking like, we're always going to be there to take care of you and we'll make sure you never starve to death, but we have more money than we need, and what do you think about giving it all away? And I mean, how do you say no to that? Which Sydney likes to always joke, like, I don't think it's legally binding to ask a 6-year-old that and take their word for it. But it seemed obvious.
Nicola and Andrew Forrest have been very public in their philanthropy, and that invites a lot of close scrutiny, and not everyone likes the way they've gone about it. You might have questions about the industry they operate in, about the way they've made their money, but clearly they've made a big commitment to supporting a whole range of causes that are unambiguously good.
I'm well aware that we've had a lot of criticism, and our children hear the criticisms as well, and maybe sometimes they probably agree with some of the criticisms that people make of us. But what I would say is that no one is more critical than we are of ourselves.
Mum and Dad, I think, have always worked together as a team. So with the enormous success that Dad has had, Mum's always been right there behind him. I think it's an attribute to how strong their marriage is that they can work so entwined and not kill each other. But it is really frustrating to see the media repeatedly always refer to her as Andrew Forrest's wife. While I'm so immensely proud of the work Dad does, it's frustrating when your own work is constantly tied to that.
Some very good advice early on with a great friend who was a media advisor to Andrew at the time. He warned me and he said, I think it's really important, you know, for the children's sake and for your own sake, that you don't ever get photographed with Andrew, because then people won't know who you are. So I did walk 2 steps behind so I would never be in the photographs. It protected me and I didn't want a profile, so that was fine.
For a long time, Mum genuinely believed that the best thing she can do is not take up space in the public eye. And I think something that has shifted in that is realising that she herself could become a lever and a voice for drawing a line in the sand on issues that she's been working on for 2 decades and has seen too little progress on.
I want to talk to you today about what I believe is the greatest travesty facing our nation. More than 20% of our kids have health or developmental vulnerabilities when they start school. As reluctant as I am to be in the public eye, I've decided that if not me, then who? And I also realise that I have the opportunity to speak to people that other people may not have access to. Perhaps I've been dismissed because I'm not to be taken seriously. Perhaps you just think this is a pet hobby for me, something I do to make myself feel useful. And yes, I am motivated by the experiences I've had, both raising and losing children. But my dedication to ensuring that every single child born in Australia gets the best start in life is far more than just a personal quest. I think I grew up in a family where I thought, well, everyone's got a fair go in Australia. Australia's a place where we make it easy for everybody and it's up to individuals, and if you don't try hard enough, then that's your own fault. And I have taken that full journey where I realise that actually it's not like that for everybody. I grew up in country New South Wales, Spices Creek, which is between Wellington and Mudgee, on the way to Goolma. And it was sheep and wheat mainly, but we did have some cattle.
Siblings, I think, called her motor mouth. Well, she'd never stopped talking once she learned.
Nick was fearless, bold, and probably a little bit naughty. Yeah.
Every day I'd say, who wants to come for a ride? And I'd come over to your place.
Because we were the only ones that were horse obsessed, and Jana lost. You know, as a 7 or 8-year-old, she rode over to our house without telling her parents. Turned up at our house, no saddle. We've got a classic photograph of her looking like that. Jodhpurs on, hair not done. What fun times, Nick.
Life was very simple, really. And I was a young and pretty hopeless mother, but we had animals and we had a lot of fun.
We felt like we were wealthy because we had everything we ever needed, but we were very aware that we couldn't afford to buy a lot of things. My elder sisters went off to boarding school. I went to the high school in Wellington because they couldn't afford for 3 of us to go to boarding school at the same time. And in the end, my parents sacrificed everything for our education. They relocated themselves, and my father took odd jobs, and our mother took a job at the school, so that I guess we got reduced fees. So I went to Frensham in year 10. I was 14, nearly 15, and I wasn't out of control, but I was having a lot of fun at the Wellington High School. And in a way, I think it changed my trajectory because I got opportunities that were extraordinary. When I finished school, I went to Canberra for 3 years. And I did a Bachelor of Arts in Secretarial Studies, but it really was like a business degree. And I ended up working in stockbroking. But all the while, I thought, I want to go travelling. So I worked, I travelled a bit, and then I had to work again.
Her jobs were very eclectic.
She worked in the eastern suburbs for Susan Renouf as a cook. She worked up in Queensland at the Blue Heeler pub. And she worked in Yorkshire as cooking grass for a family there.
But I wasn't pursuing a career. I was always looking for what am I interested in or what I want to do.
I can remember meeting Nicola like this morning. We were holding a housewarming party for all of Mum's friends, and Mum's friend's daughter was Nicola. This bouncy, energetic, feminine form came dancing across the lawn, and I was in a dressing gown still putting drinks out. Yeah, very casual, thinking, well, we're out in the bush, half an hour late.
I had no idea who he was, and clearly wasn't reading any newspapers because he'd already made a splash. Tousle-headed stockbroking legend is what they used to refer to him then. So I, just being me, walked across the lawn and went, "Hi, I'm Nicola. Can I give you a hand?" I was so embarrassed to be early. I was mortified that we were so early. "Can I give you a hand?"
I said, "Look, glasses are here, drinks are over there." I ran off, had a shower, slammed the jeans on, and when I came back, she was serving drinks. So I thought, oh, what a girl.
I couldn't stop thinking about this guy, just thinking he was very different to anyone I'd ever met. Sort of a big personality, but very genuine. We got engaged and were planning to get married in the January 1991. And Andrew got cold feet.
I thought, hang on, this is coming at me like a steam train. I don't see any rush on this. And so I said, listen, let's call off the date.
And I said, you know what? I actually find being engaged, you're neither one thing nor the other. And I think if you want to put it back, let's just call the whole thing off.
I'm not one to bluff, so I said, sure, if that's what you want, I'll roll with it.
I then said to Andrew, look, I'm going to go to Europe. Please just don't contact me.
But then Andrew followed. And then they travelled a bit together, which we didn't like the idea of. You know, it didn't sound like a good thing.
When I reached out, we just had a torrent of communication between us. The love didn't stop for a day, really.
And he proposed to me again. I remember my parents saying, "Are you sure this is what you want?" And I said, you know what, I know I'll never be bored if I'm with Andrew.
Andrew Forrest is really part of one of the most influential families in Western Australia.
Welcome to Christmas Creek. Thanks, buddy. Good to be home.
His great-great-uncle, John Forrest, was an explorer who opened up remote parts of Western Australia.
Andrew Forrest began as a stockbroker, but he always had big dreams and ambitions to build a business. In that sense, he's a classic entrepreneur.
I have been very involved along the way with all the projects that Andrew has done. You know, he always says I'm his biggest critic, but he does listen to me. So I do get the opportunity to say to him, what about this or what about that? And same with Anaconda.
In true Forrest tradition, Andrew raised over $1 billion to build Anaconda, Western Australia's largest nickel plant.
Andrew Forrest really came to prominence when he led Anaconda Nickel, a classic high-risk Western Australian mining project.
I'm delighted to be associated with such a tremendously successful Australian venture.
At one stage there, it was looking like a sensational success story, but then they got to a point where they hit some technical problems.
In an 11th hour compromise, Mr. Forrest has agreed to step down as chief executive.
Ultimately, Glencore, big global player, took over the business and he was ousted. And a lot of people lost money as a result of that, and it really tarnished his reputation.
With Anaconda Nickel going pear-shaped, there was a sense of shame in a way because there'd been such excitement about the opportunities it created. And so there was a sense of we've failed a lot of people, and Andrew always felt really responsible for that.
Through all this pretty tumultuous time in Perth with
anaconda. Nick and Andrew were also suffering a great personal loss, which they had to deal with.
We were living in Perth and I got pregnant. She was due the 2nd of June, 1988. So I'd been preparing Grace and Sophia that you've got a little sister coming and, you know, Mummy's going in to have the baby. We thought, we'll call her Tilly, Matilda. Perfect pregnancy, whole way through. I was due to have a doctor's appointment on the Monday, which was the 22nd. And on the weekend, I'd had some contractions. I was pretty uncomfortable. When I went into the appointment, I said, oh, I didn't think I was going to make this appointment. And he said, why not? And I said, because I haven't felt the baby move for 24 hours. And, you know, there's a saying that when a baby goes quiet, it's just before it's going to be born. And he was going, and then he went, oh, this machine must be broken. I'm going to send you down the road for an ultrasound. I can't hear the baby. And at that moment, I thought, somehow I knew. And, you know, nothing wrong with her. Perfect, beautiful little girl. Stillborn.
When Mum came home from hospital without the baby, it was quite confusing. And I just remember Dad making our breakfast for a while, not seeing Mum in the mornings. So I think that loss obviously was devastating for my mother and really formative in our family.
We actually had a post-mortem done because we wanted to know if there was anything we could help other people or that would to come to terms ourselves. You immediately blame yourself. You think, what have I done wrong? Something's happened.
Matilda really was a fabulous gift, not ours to hold, but whenever we're asked about our children, certainly in a quiet environment, we'll say, yeah, we've got 4 kids, 3 on earth and 1 in heaven.
We were so blessed to then have Sydney. So we did have another one quite quickly afterwards. And that took a great step of faith from me because what I didn't want was to be fearful.
Deep family tragedies like that can really challenge relationships. It was a really tough period. And, you know, it just made me love the girl more going through that deep sense of tragedy and coming out the other side, still absolutely united.
Andrew Forrest is staking his family's future on an ambitious new mining venture. It's a gamble few would dare.
Me having to go overseas to sell this.
Early 2000s and the China boom is starting to come on the horizon, and Forrest could see that there would be massive demand for iron ore. The Pilbara was just right for a new player to come along. So he raised the capital to develop the mines, to build the railways, and then the port infrastructure as well. I mean, it was breathtakingly ambitious.
I remember saying, and how much is that going to cost? You know, because we'd just been through Anaconda. And he said, about $1 billion, or I think he might have even said $2 billion. And I just went, oh my God. And I said, just one more project, please, just one more project.
That was typical of Nick saying, look, I want you to be cautious, I want you to be careful, but hey, let's have a real crack at this.
If successful, he'll become a powerful figure on the national landscape. But he's also risking millions and the family's reputation.
If you think 200 million is possible, I would go for it.
They managed to get their first mine opened in 2006 and second one in 2008. So absolutely record time with the investors sort of breathing down their necks saying, are you going to do it? Are you actually going to make it? And they did.
Over the last couple of years, iron ore has been on a roll and Fortescue has delivered amazing profits, and they're now ranked as one of the top 10 companies on the ASX.
Today, if you take the Fortescue share price, the value of their wealth is somewhere around 25 billion.
So that does make the Forrest the second wealthiest family in the country after Gina Reinhardt.
How long are you going to be in Canberra? Well, I'm still trying to work out how to get there, but I'm hoping to get there. It honestly feels a little bit surreal, in as much as that I don't feel myself as a billionaire, that I'm any different in my attitudes. collaboration with the National Gallery around Earth, and so for the fire and flood resilience.
UCB was a term that I coined a few years ago. It stands for Undercover Billionaire.
It's going to be their major exhibition for 2020.
The UCB came from the fact that she'd be encouraging Dad and Sydney and I to eat a week-old expired yoghurt because it'd be wasted. And yeah, the UCB does not like waste in any form, and I believe quite genuinely if their net worth was where it is now or if it was absolutely nothing, she'd be the same on that.
There reaches a certain point where you don't need any more money. So we've been members of the Giving Pledge for almost 10 years.
Earlier this year, mining billionaire Andrew Forrest became the first Australian to join the Global Giving Pledge. Like Bill and Melinda Gates, he and his wife Nicola are now dedicating most of their wealth to philanthropy.
The Giving Pledge was established by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. You had to be a billionaire to join the club, and you had to commit to giving away more than half of your wealth before you died.
Are going to give 99% away.
The first Australians to join the Giving Pledge were Andrew and Nicola Forrest.
Twiggy Forrest and his wife are donating $65 million to higher education in Western Australia.
It's not every day you get to make a donation like this.
I think it's super important that people are public, because I think it's the only way we can get role models.
$400 million, the largest donation by living Australians.
The mechanics of giving away wealth in one's lifetime, the way Nicola and Andrew Forrest have done it is primarily to create a foundation, in this case, Minderoo Foundation. We have 11 initiatives, like trying to rid the world of modern-day slavery, collaborating against cancer, trying to end Indigenous disparity. Today, there's over $2.5 billion in the foundation.
Good morning, everybody.
Last year, we spent $129 million, and this year, we plan to spend somewhere between $150 and $180 million.
Really, the DNA of our organisation is about helping empower people and improve the situation for others.
When you look at the scale of the work they're doing, they're giving away more than $100 million a year today, which is extraordinary. You know, on any absolute scale, $100 million is a lot of money.
You have to make sure you know who's already doing what in the community.
When you look at what they've committed to do, the challenge that they are building towards is to giving closer to $1 billion a year away.
They understand what the problems are and they need to articulate them.
The great challenge for them is to now deliver on giving away the majority of their wealth to needy causes that they care about over their lifetime.
Given your fortune stands at around $25 billion, there's still a long way to go before that pledge is satisfied, isn't there?
Yeah, well, we're hoping we're going to have a long lifetime. So it's within our lifetime. I think as we have scaled up with our initiatives and we have built the capacity within our organisation, you will see that things will change. It's not just about giving away money, it's about making impact.
So what's your name?
What's your name?
My name's Nick.
The most important thing that we are doing at Minderoo Foundation is Thrive by 5, to help every Australian child reach their full potential.
We're doing single discipline therapy and we just know that we can do so much more if we're able.
I think the cornerstone for my mum and my dad in their work is that the way in which they lost Matilda was completely out of their control. And I think that is what definitely drove them to think, what is in our ability to change? What can we control in outcome for other children?
Enrolments have dropped a lot over the last 12 months.
With Matilda, the thing that I had absolutely learnt was what happens in utero does affect the trajectory of a child. 90% of the brain is formed in those first 5 years. And more than 20% of children arrive at school developmentally delayed here in Australia, which is just unspeakable. If they have had hearing problems or speech problems or they haven't had the basics in phonics and they're unable to continue to learn, then by the time they're 8 or 9, you've lost them in the system. And by the time they're 12 or 13, they're completely disengaged.
We do believe that this is the issue that the next government that leads this country, if they take this issue on, they're the ones that are going to be there.
We need to have an overarching system that supports families.
We need to value those people that look after our most vulnerable.
Somewhere you can reach out for help, but you only have to go to one place. And then, you know, you're being looked after and then you don't fall out of the system.
I've seen the power of such an approach on a visit to Chalice, a primary school just outside of Perth.
Who would like to read a book on their holidays?
Chalice Primary School headmistress, Lee Mezzamucci, refused to accept that her children were going to be flatline below the state NAPLAN results purely because of the postcode of where they've grown up.
Can I come to your house and have lunch and a...
We decided as a foundation that we would support her work.
It was not me.
What Lee did was create a centre on the school grounds for the young mothers and families that were coming to the school so that she could help those families prepare those children for school. And she made it possible for any service that those families might need to be available at that school or a referral system.
Put your hat on your beautiful hair that's been...
In practical terms, what it means is child health nurse on site, full-time. For families who are ready, they then start to coming to any of our parenting courses, which leads into our pre-kindergarten program.
There's lots of opportunities to talk about all the food.
And the most astonishing part is that a school where they had never met the state average for their NAPLAN results, within 2 or 3 years, was not only meeting the state average, it was exceeding it. The science clearly shows that we have to get it right in the first 5 years. A fleeting window of time that science says is pivotal to the emotional, cognitive and social development of your child.
Some really interesting work that we did with Nicola was looking at the cost of late intervention. So what happens if we don't address the issues in early childhood? And what we found was that it was billions of dollars.
$5.9 billion for child protection, $2.7 billion for youth crime, $1.3 billion for mental health. How on earth can politicians in this country pretend there is no problem here? It's a ridiculous agenda, as it always is when you come to Canberra. We are going from meeting to meeting to all the ministers that we could get meetings with to give each and every one of them our budget submission for Thrive by 5 and to talk through how we really believe the country needs to move forward. I lay awake last night, didn't get a lot of sleep, thinking, you know, am I going to speak or say things? But I'm better when I get a bit emotional.
What Nicola is now specifically campaigning for is for an increase in paid parental leave, substantial pay rises for childcare workers, and she wants high-quality preschool education for 3-year-olds to be accessible for all Australians.
Yeah, on the way.
White tea, please.
Nicola Forrest is only just one of many voices that are campaigning in this area.
I've known lots of the education ministers because I've been coming here for a long time.
I think that whole area of women's issues, as they're known, perhaps unfairly, is going to have a fairly big role in the election.
Obviously, we'd encourage you if they don't, you know, in the budget reply would be a nice place to do it.
One of the high-profile recruits they've had is Jay Weatherall. He was the Labor Premier in South Australia.
As is 3-year-old, 2 years of preschool. So
we did get into meetings that others haven't been able to get into on the strength of her, I think, passion, assertiveness, and frankly, the resources that she can bring to bear behind the campaign.
Are you able to give us a commitment that going forward into this election that this is going to be one of your top priorities?
Look, it is going to be one of our top priorities. There's no doubt about it.
Whatever differences people might have with the forests, I think they respect the fact that they don't just want to do things to make themselves feel better. They want to actually shift the dial.
You're on the payroll, though.
Sure, but, you know, I've got lots of things I could do. I'm doing this because it means something.
If you're looking for reasons to criticise the forests, there's no shortage of things that people can latch onto. They were criticised a lot for not paying enough tax in the early days, but now they are a big taxpayer. Some people don't like the mining industry. The industry has high carbon emissions, but look, the business is pivoting far more rapidly than most of their peers towards green energy. There's also been criticism about the relationship between Fortescue and Aboriginal traditional owners up in the Pilbara. I think this is a bigger issue for the forests.
Negotiations over royalties broke down several years ago, with FMG's founder Andrew Forrest saying he didn't want to create mining welfare.
Mining has impacted on our country very badly, I'd say. The Yindjibarndi people, before we was all one, and now it has divided us.
Fortescue Metals has gone and mined Yindjibarndi land, even though it has no agreement with the traditional owners.
The Yindjibarndi Aboriginal Corporation has pursued Fortescue through the courts, all the way to the High Court, and has been successful.
This has been a very long, ongoing, divisive piece of litigation. It's a tremendous victory for the Yindjibarndi people.
The ruling paves the way for the traditional owners to pursue a multi-million-dollar compensation payout.
Some of the dealings that the companies had are really not that commendable. This is something I think that the forests need to think about addressing, because if they want to have this great legacy, what's happened with the Yindjibarndi, I think, is a pretty serious blemish on the record.
We've employed more skilled Aboriginal people than any other company in history, and given out more business contracts than the Australian government to Aboriginal companies by a multiple, and changed the lives of thousands, and I'm very happy with that record.
People can criticise how money is made and how it's given away, and I would actually say that our eldest daughter, Grace, has always said, you know, philanthropy can look like a dirty thing, because if people have made money in a bad way, then it's their excuse to make themselves feel better by giving it away. I do not see us in that camp at all. We are determined to have sustainable and ethical businesses.
We're just going to get a group shot, so if I can get you to wander over this way.
I think Nicola Forrest is at a very active and interesting stage of her life.
It's absolutely beautiful, isn't it? Wendy?
She is the convener of Women for Progress, and it is a very interesting group of women from a diverse range of backgrounds.
Socially distancing, of course.
We're not all here today, but all from all political persuasions, all cultural backgrounds, all age ranges.
We all have one voice of a shared story, and it's about gender equality, and it's about putting women at the forefront of the next election.
If we can all get together and form a consensus on what we think are the priorities for women and to make our country a better place, then, you know, what better time?
If not now, then when?
Yeah, so
It's
yes,
got to be
I
now.
am hopeful.
What she is doing, I think, is taking on a much greater public leadership role.
Perfect.
So I think we are going to be seeing a lot more of Nicola Forrest, the person.
And thank you very much. Done. Thank you.
A boost to foreign aid. Labor unveils its plan to fight China's influence in the Pacific. April rains in Queensland trigger flash flooding in the north and jubilation in the west. Creating a stink, the Queensland Council turning human waste into renewable energy. And a milestone for Target Tasmania, an event changed by tragedy. This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Tyne Logan. China's sudden security incursion into Solomon Islands has prompted Labor to step forward with its own plan for the Pacific. The package of foreign aid, defence training and extra Australian broadcasting is meant to counter what it calls the biggest security blunder by this country since World War II. But Scott Morrison's shrugged it off as a Labor rerun of schemes the government's already doing. Political editor Andrew Probyn has more.
G'day, how are you?
when being Prime Minister requires a soft touch.
A bit delicate.
They are very delicate, aren't they?
But if you think making macarons is difficult,
there we go.
Healing relations with a Macron will be trickier.
I wish him every congratulations for what is an historic victory for President Macron.
Hello, how are you? Andrew Probyn from the ABC. The re-elected French president, who had a spectacular falling out with Scott Morrison over a cancelled submarine contract.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think, I know. Will be critical in a coordinated response to Beijing's influence in the Indo-Pacific, where France has more than 1 million citizens. China's striking of a military pact with the Solomons of major embarrassment to Scott Morrison's so-called Pacific step-up.
The bloke who just keeps dropping the ball, the bloke who went missing while China negotiated and signed a security deal on our doorstep.
Labor revealing the approach it would take to make Australia the Pacific partner of choice. An extra $500 million in aid over 4 years, 3,000 permanent migration spots for Pacific Islanders, allowing seasonal workers to bring their families, financing climate and clean energy projects and extending the reach of ABC broadcasts.
I sent in the AFP. The Labor Party wants to send in the ABC. They have a Q&A solution in the Pacific.
Although the PM is refusing to say what he would do if the Chinese established a military base on the Solomons, which he said on the weekend was a red line.
No responsible Prime Minister would go into the sort of detail that you're asking for.
No point in beating your chest if you're beaten to the punch.
Where's that coming from?
On climate, the coalition's accused of sending conflicting messages to rural and city constituents. Queensland Senator Matt Canavan dismissing the government's net zero emissions plan.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway.
Its candidate in the Queensland seat of Flynn describing the government's net zero emissions by 2050 commitment as flexible.
Our candidate in Flynn was talking about is how we get there. He wasn't talking about the commitment himself.
Labor too having to explain how coal production won't be affected by its push to penalise major emitters.
No coal project will face a carbon constraint that is beyond, that will make them internationally uncompetitive.
Scott Morrison's embrace of net zero by 2050 constrains coalition attacks on Labor over climate change. And the Beijing blindside in the Solomons also blunts any government boast on national security. Not that this is stopping them. The PM and his ministers continue to talk tough on China. But if the government's rhetoric was matched by actual defence capability, Australia would have one of the world's strongest militaries. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
The divide over climate change policy hurt Labor last election. This time around, both parties are struggling to overcome internal disagreements and to control their messaging. Here's data analyst Casey Briggs.
When it comes to staying on message on coal and climate change, the coalition's got some problems. This is Colin Boyce. He's the LNP's candidate for the regional Queensland seat of Flynn.
Zero net carbon emissions by 2050. Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room.
The coalition's division goes all the way to the top. The PM and the Nationals' deputy leader talking completely at odds.
Our commitment to net zero by 2050 is a commitment of the Australian government that I made in Glasgow. It is the government's absolute policy.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson's said he's pausing the net zero commitment. Germany's building coal and gas infrastructure. Italy's reopening coal-fired power plants. It's all over.
The seat Colin Boyce is trying to win is home to about a tenth of all of Australia's coal mining jobs. And this is a part of the country that Labor had deep troubles in 3 years ago. Remember the Stop Adani convoy? Didn't really do any favours for Labor in this seat. And so this time, the opposition's trying not to repeat some of those same mistakes. Here is its candidate for Flynn in 2022.
That they wouldn't say coal. That was the issue. I will say it, and I'll say it every day.
But head 1,600 kilometres south where Labor's more worried about losing votes to the left than it is to the right, and there, the message is pretty different. This is Labor's candidate for Melbourne talking about higher renewable energy targets. And here's MP for Macnamara, Josh Burns, talking about a quick transition away from fossil fuels. So Labor still has seats where that climate coal messaging is butting heads in different parts of the country. What's new, though, is that the Coalition have some of those seats as well, defending ones in regional Queensland and some of these inner city seats, seats like Wentworth and seats like North Sydney, where the candidates are posting messages like this online in support of the net zero target. It's a big country. These are broad churches of political parties, and sometimes that makes staying on message hard.
The CEO of Guide Dogs Victoria has been stood down after appearing in election campaign ads endorsing the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. An independent investigation has been launched after Karen Hayes featured in letterbox flyers handed out in the seat of Kooyong and in social media campaigns. Guide Dogs Victoria says the board had no knowledge of the ads and did not endorse them. Charities can be disqualified for promoting political parties or candidates. New South Wales teachers have voted to walk off the job next week for 24 hours, citing crippling workloads, poor salaries and chronic staff shortages as the reasons. They say the current pay offer just isn't enough.
Classrooms. They are fundamental to children's education.
We need to get that built as soon as possible.
As the state government planned the future of school construction, a more pressing problem loomed above.
The crisis in New South Wales. It's a teacher shortage crisis.
So today what we're going to do in maths is we're actually going
to... The Teachers Federation says the 2.5% pay rise offered by the government will do nothing to solve that crisis. So public school teachers across the state will strike next Wednesday.
Teacher shortage is being caused by uncompetitive salaries, salaries that have declined relative to other degreed professions over the last 30 years, and crippling workload.
Here in New South Wales at 2.5%, we have the highest pay rises of any state in Australia. But where we can do more, we will. We'll continue to work through those issues and get a good outcome.
Parents are being warned to plan for disruption.
I think it's really difficult for working parents. They don't really know where to send their kids.
When you homeschool, you actually appreciate how much work the teachers actually do.
This disruption on the 4th of May pales into insignificance compared to the daily disruption being experienced in our school due to teacher shortages.
You know, it's been a very disruptive 2 years for our parents and for our students, and that's why it's disappointing that they're choosing to strike.
The Teachers Federation is upping the stakes with this latest round of industrial action. In addition to next week's strike, teachers are now authorised to walk off the job if a government MP visits a public school. A hearing in the Industrial Relations Commission has been set for early May. Jake Lapham, ABC News, Sydney.
An Adelaide stripper claims she was fired after raising concerns about a colleague's alleged sexual assault while working. She's now suing her former workplace and challenging her classification as a contractor in the Employment Tribunal. Gabriella Marchant reports.
A colleague of mine was sexually assaulted at the club. There was no security up there. She was quite literally trapped. I raised it with management and then I didn't really see any evidence of any kind of follow-up.
Stripper Luna claims she was dismissed from Adelaide's strip club The Firm after raising workplace safety concerns over her colleague's alleged assault. She's now suing her former workplace in the SA Employment Tribunal, which The Firm is contesting.
They just cut all contact with me without any notice or explanation.
The firm says a WorkSafe SA inspection found it complied with relevant legislation and rejects that dancers are ever blamed for sexual misconduct. Luna also wants the tribunal to rule she's an employee, not a contractor.
They want to be able to dictate when we work and how we work, but then they also don't want to be liable for us.
The dancers allege it's standard for clubs to withhold pay via so-called fines.
Common fines that we would see in the industry would be if we're late, if we don't roster on to a shift that the club would like us to roster onto, if we're sick too many times in a given period.
The firm says dancers are well remunerated and classifying them as employees wouldn't be accurate. It says strippers can work dates and times they choose, but concedes once they commit to a shift, they're expected to attend. The dancers say historical stigma disempowers dancers in the industry.
One of my favourite quotes from a manager is, "A new girl turns 18 every day."
Luna says if clubs won't engage them as employees, they should allow dancers to truly work as contractors like in the ACT, where laws allow sexual touching.
Strippers there are at liberty to offer dancers that have a certain amount of more interpersonal contact. What the stripper would earn it's all theirs.
Luna's case will be heard in the Employment Tribunal this week. Gabriella Marchant, ABC News, Adelaide.
Russia has warned there is a real threat of World War III breaking out if the West continues to supply weapons to Ukraine. The Kremlin unleashed attacks on 5 railway stations to disrupt supplies of foreign weapons to the front in eastern Ukraine. And while the battle for Donbass rages on, ruined towns around the capital, Kyiv, are starting to rebuild. Europe correspondent Nick Dole reports from Irpin.
Much of the damage in Ukraine is of Russia's making, but what happened to the bridge at Irpin was self-inflicted. Ukraine blew it up to stop Russia's advance into the capital. But a new river crossing's already been built so that people aren't cut off. In a nearby hospital, staff are replacing the walls and windows that were blown out by Russian shelling. During the attack last month, the staff here lived in the basement and worked around the clock so they could treat people who'd been injured. Some patients who didn't make it are buried in a yard out the back. They'll have to be exhumed.
This is our city and it will be rebuilt. This clinic is needed because people are coming back. We shouldn't need to wait until the end of the war.
A massive effort is underway to clear the streets. Those who've returned to Irpin who can't find their cars come here.
So, Sergei, this is your car up here. What on earth happened to it, do you think?
Yes, that's my car, he says. It was destroyed by a shell.
It's confronting enough individually, but when you see all these cars that have been shelled or shot at, it gives you a real sense of just how much destruction there was. And this is just in one part of the neighbourhood. And here are some of the vehicles that haven't caught fire, and that's where you can see some of the most horrific detail. Look at this. This car would have offered almost no protection from this blast. You can see inside the upholstery's been torn through. Some of the shrapnel looks like it's gone right through it. And over here on the windscreen of this four-wheel drive, someone's written children. A parent has tried to warn the Russians that there are kids inside the car. And gazing through here, I can see a baby seat in the front. But despite that, this windscreen is still riddled with bullets.
Just up the road, Alexander's returned home to see the damage a tank did to his apartment block. He's still hoping to bring his wife and children back here.
We want to stay. We only want to live in Irpin.
His neighbour downstairs, Luba, returned to find her roof had caught fire. She's trying to make it livable again.
Yes, of course it's hard. There's no water or electricity, but this is my apartment, my home. I had no idea how much I loved my home until now.
With the Russians driven out of this region, people here are appreciating home that little bit more. It's not how they left it, but this land is still theirs. Nick Dole, ABC News, Irpin.
Townsville has recorded its wettest April in more than 2 decades after heavy rain drenched the region and caused flash flooding. It was an anxious wait for some as backyards went underwater. But out in Western Queensland, the final burst of wet season has been cause for celebration.
Swapping cars for kayaks as streets turn to streams, these Townsville locals are soaking up their new waterfront views.
We're used to it. Been here 25 years, so yeah, it's fun.
Deerigan has been drenched with almost 300 millimetres of rain in 24 hours, among the heaviest falls in Townsville. Julia Lowe's home is surrounded by floodwaters.
At the back of my house, it's about 5 foot, I suppose. So we've actually got a deck for the clothesline, and it's like my own little personal jetty at the minute.
Some, like Earl Tutt, are on edge. He's still scarred by the 2019 floods, which inundated his home.
A nervous or anxious wait to see just how deep it was going to get.
It's been an unseasonably late burst of wet weather, leaving parks, playgrounds, bridges and roads underwater.
For Townsville, that was its heaviest April rainfall since 2000.
The local SES has received more than 30 calls for help. Swiftwater crews were called to rescue a woman trapped on the other side of this flooded road.
We brought another casualty out last night, had a medical condition, assisted them, but then the water started rising, and because it was dark, it was a bit dangerous to bring them out at 2:30 this morning.
For kids like Mason, the flooding has meant a day off school, but he's not too bothered.
It's horrible, and I want to go fishing in it.
This is the main road out of Townsville, cut off by fast-flowing floodwaters from the Bowley River after heavy rain in the catchment. It's been a headache for drivers, but for most, the wet weather has been welcome.
It's a similar story in the Burdekin, where the Horton River catchment hit major flood levels. In Western Queensland, the unexpected drenching has closed roads and filled up parched dams and creeks. Graziers are rejoicing after a failed summer wet season.
It's beautiful water, lovely rain. Yep, it'll set us up nicely for winter. It was getting a bit late in the season.
Marcel Chandler's property south of Barcaldine received 280 millimetres yesterday, the biggest fall since records began on the property more than 80 years ago.
The old rainfall chart back to 1939. Nothing ever in the records for that amount of rain in a 24-hour period.
Floodwaters are lapping at the doors of some residents in Longreach. Most are taking it in their stride, but for Nikita Shute, it's too close for comfort.
We couldn't do anything, really. We just moved all our stuff.
The Weather Bureau says the trough has weakened and the heaviest falls have now passed, but there'll be plenty of mopping up to do. Lily Nothling, ABC News, Townsville.
Logan, south of Brisbane, has become the first place in the southern hemisphere to turn human waste into renewable energy, opening Australia's first biosolids gasification plant. The process also produces a high-grade fertiliser to be sold to the agricultural sector.
This may come from human waste, but doesn't smell like it.
Oh, it doesn't smell like sewage, I'll tell you that.
The first of its kind in the southern hemisphere, Logan Water's biosolids gasification plant is now operational.
It's quite a complex little piece of engineering.
Water is taken out of the sewage sludge, which is then dried out before going into a furnace where it is burnt, and the gases produced are used to power the facility. What remains is a substance called biochar.
So the idea really came from the trucking problem, that we were sending an enormous number of trucks through the community, using a lot of diesel, and it was costing us a lot of money.
Logan City Council says it will reduce carbon emissions by about 6,000 tonnes a year.
It's pushing us towards carbon neutrality, and it's obviously helping the world overcome its issues. If we had one of these in China, everywhere in China, the world would be a much better place.
The $28 million project has taken 18 months to build, with a $6 million injection from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. The biochar will be used as a high-grade fertiliser in the agricultural sector and to make building materials.
The council is working with scientists at QUT in Brisbane to see what other ways this product can be used in the future.
One thing we're looking at is that we might be able to activate the carbon and use it as an odour control source, for instance.
We will explore every marketable opportunity to obviously get the best return.
Louisa Rebgetz, ABC News, Logan.
The New Zealand Warriors have suffered the worst loss in their history, a humiliating 70 points to 10 hiding at the hands of the Melbourne Storm. The home team scored 54 unanswered points in the second half, which is the most since the NRL began. Winger Xavier Coates finished with 4 tries and 6 of his teammates crossed the lines on a horrible night for the Warriors.
Holland versus Walsh. The speedster can't stop the powerhouse.
It's disappointing to actually sit here and say that, but some people looked for the easiest way out they could, and that's sad.
The 70 points to 10 result equalled the Storm's highest score, which came against the Dragons in the year 2000. Targa Tasmania competitors have set off for this year's 30th anniversary of the event. But as it hits the milestone, the well-known rally will be different. The deaths of 3 competitors last year have prompted a raft of new rules.
A ceremonial start in Launceston kicked off this year's Targa Tasmania. Cars being flagged away at a sedate pace before things quickened up for the annual rally.
You know, the early years, they often joked about this thing would never see 30 years, let alone 10 years, 5 years.
Just under 500 cars are taking part in this year's event, a record field to mark the race's 30th year. But as well as a celebration of the milestone, the event is also coming back from tragedy. 3 competitors were killed in last year's Targa, forcing sweeping safety changes. Targa now has a speed limit of 200 kilometres an hour. Organisers have also reduced speeds on some crests, jumps and dips that can make cars airborne.
Crests and dips always worried us, even as competitors, like cars leaving the road, some cars are designed to do it, but so many of the cars now are not.
Competitors are embracing the changes.
I am confident that it'll make the event safer. Targa adopted all the recommendations from their full review.
You can't protect everything and everyone, but they've done a really good job to bring it up to as many higher standards as possible.
In the wake of last year's fatal crashes, 23 recommendations were made to better protect competitors.
If you get in a race car, you've got to expect something might happen, but we don't want it to happen.
The event will increasingly focus on touring drivers rather than competitive cars, with the racing field getting smaller each year.
The event's got an amazing future, but probably not as a full-on motorsport event. It's still our DNA, and you'll still see people racing cars at Targa. But the tours, we've gone from 30 to 300 in the last 5 years.
Competitors will take on 34 stages like this one over coming days across hundreds of kilometres of Tasmanian roads. The car rally finishes in Hobart on Sunday. Damien McIntyre, ABC News, Hillwood.
Now with the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
Well, the rain in Queensland is finally easing after more than 300 millimetres around Townsville early today and inland at Longreach 109 millimetres, the biggest one-day total in 33 years. Well, now, after soaking the North Pastoral districts of South Australia, the bullseye for rain is Western New South Wales. Broken Hill has notched up 51 millimetres in just 12 hours. That rain will head further east tonight and tomorrow and become less intense. There'll also be some showers on the New South Wales coast. In the west, another cold front will bring a fresh burst of rain, maybe thunderstorms tonight to Perth, spreading across the southern inland later in the day. And in western New South Wales, there is a warning of heavy rainfall. 6-hour totals of 40 to 60 millimetres are possible in that yellow area there. In Queensland, showers and thunderstorms over the central interior, also along the coast between Cooktown and Mackay. Patchy rain for the rest of the east coast. Possible showers over the far northern interior and the Gulf country. In Brisbane, you are in for an afternoon shower or two. There's that rain across inland New South Wales, mostly about central and northern areas. The chance of a thunderstorm in the northwest. There'll be showers in the east, and Sydney will have between 8 and 15 millimetres of rain. In Canberra, afternoon showers. Cloudy across Victoria with a few showers on and north of the Divide, maybe 1 or 2 in the south. It'll be an overcast day in Melbourne. For Tasmania, showers increasing about the north and east, spreading to central and southern districts in the evening, and it should stay dry until those evening showers in Hobart. It'll be mostly dry over South Australia, apart from a shower or 2 on and to the east of the ranges, and later in the day over the Nullarbor Plain, partly cloudy in Adelaide. In the west, though, showers and gusty thunderstorms over the southwest land division incursion, Gascoyne, Goldfields, Eucla and the nearby interior. 8 to 15 millimetres of rain on the way for Perth, a possible shower on the Pilbara coast and over far eastern parts of the Barkly and Carpentaria districts, plus across the top end. And Darwin will have afternoon showers and thunderstorms.
And that's ABC Late News. I'm Tyne Logan. Thank you for your company this evening. Have a great night.
I am a 94-year-old and still singing every day. When I come to Australia, I couldn't speak English at all, not one word. So. The most important thing for me to make me happy is my family, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and my garden. I think working in a garden is always essential for me because I grew up on a farm in Italy. And that's why I love it. I think that be around with my grandchildren is the most important thing to my heart, that I love them. I say to the young people, work out what you love to do and do it. I'm Biase Michele. I'm proud to be 94 years young. La dolce vita, the sweet life.
See the bullet holes all over the wall.
It's the show where anything can happen.
We are taking back the power.
As we get closer to the separatists, the military is on alert.
This is the latest murder to have happened here.
2 ABC powerhouses in one night.
All the big issues, no small talk.
To tell the best stories.
Reconnecting you to the rest of the world.
From home and right across the globe.
We've been allowed here to witness an extraordinary awakening.
Foreign Correspondent, followed by Q&A. Thursdays from 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's such a scary thing, feeling like you're not in control of your mind. I would put myself in the fetal position. It was terrifying.
In a unique social experiment, 7 strangers will expose their deepest fears.
Sometimes I think, why am I here?
It takes a lot to come out and talk about mental health.
Can art and creativity heal invisible wounds?
Have you ever felt like there's so much pressure on you?
And help them paint a brighter future.
There's something shifted inside me that's allowed me to express myself.
Whoa! Hosted by Natalie Bassingthwaite.
Look at this!
With some of Australia's best-known artists.
All will be revealed.
Here we go.
Oh my God, wow.
Space 22 starts May 17 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Justice and humanity.
Boost economic growth.
Women have been great role models.
The city has been in lockdown.
Welcome to the program. Week 3 of the election campaign has seen the focus shift decisively to China's deal with the Solomon Islands. The opposition's targeting the government's national security credentials, traditionally an area of strength for the coalition. Here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
That smells fantastic.
Oh, mate, I didn't know that.
The Morrison government's dropped the ball at every stage.
A strong coalition government that's running a strong economy.
But they got Mr Morrison, the bloke who just keeps dropping the ball.
They are playing politics with the Pacific.
Mr Morrison doesn't like to listen, and he certainly doesn't like to act.
Another great linkage.
I think a really good thing for the people of the Pacific.
For all the voter exasperation about gotcha moments and the focus on gaffes, election campaigns are all about establishing a dominant message on the day, on putting your opponents on the back foot. Week 3 has seen a decisive shift in the election campaign.
Jobs, jobs, and jobs. A strong economy means a stronger future.
We had 2 weeks in which the dominant line was, if you don't understand the economy, how can you possibly know how to run it? That is, the coalition's line. But now it's all about the government dropping the ball, about the Prime Minister going missing, and the perpetual references to holding a hose.
This is a hose you have to hold, put it bluntly. This needs time and attention. You cannot abdicate or step away from responsibility.
The wild card in this campaign has been the Solomon Islands security deal with China. for a government that likes to spruik its defence and national security credentials, that has spent a lot of the campaign at defence facilities, and which has been dialling up its anti-Chinese rhetoric, the Solomons deal has put a big question mark over its credentials.
What happens if the red line you've drawn in Solomon Islands is breached? Are we talking military action? What sort of response would you have?
Well, it would not be responsible for me to be speculating in public about what Australia, the United States and others would be doing in circumstances such as that. That would not be a responsible thing to do.
This from a Prime Minister who on the weekend said that Chinese bases in our region would be a red line for both Australia and the United States. The government's stepped-up rhetoric on the Solomons, including Defence Minister Peter Dutton's Anzac Day warning that we had to prepare for war, set the scene for the opposition to spell out some detailed policies about the Pacific today.
Australians understand this is a time of risk. They understand it's a time of uncertainty and they want a government that does the work to keep them safe.
Labor unveiled a package of measures that includes a defence school for members of Pacific Island Defence and Security Forces, a doubling of the Maritime Security Program to deal with illegal fishing, more funding for the ABC to broadcast into the region, and a $525 million increase in development assistance. Labor is also promising support for Pacific climate change projects and, significantly, an overhaul of Pacific labour schemes which would ease workforce shortages here. The government was dismissive.
What they're effectively saying is they're going to keep doing what we've been doing. There's one difference though. I sent in the AFP. The Labor Party wants to send in the ABC when it comes to their Pacific solution.
But the government's credentials will be under pressure on other fronts this week. Tomorrow, the Bureau of Statistics will release the quarterly inflation numbers. With prices rising on everything from fuel to food and housing, the Reserve Bank has signalled the need to raise interest rates as inflation lifts beyond its 2 to 3% target range. If the number is big enough, the speculation will be intense between now and next Tuesday's RBA board meeting about the prospect of interest rates rising as early as next week. That's a whole week of election campaign speculation, even if rates ultimately don't rise. And then there is the question of the government's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050.
We have committed to a pathway to 2050, OK? We have committed.
Zero net carbon emissions by 2050. Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room as we proceed into the future.
Yeah, well, the net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson's said he's pausing the net zero commitment. Germany's building coal and gas infrastructure. Italy's reopening coal-fired power plants. It's all over.
The Nationals candidate for the Queensland coal seat of Flynn, Colin Boyce, opened up the question of the Coalition's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 yesterday with his suggestion that there was, quote, wiggle room in the commitment.
What our candidate in Flynn was talking about is how we get there. He wasn't talking about the commitment himself, and he's clarified that today. Our commitment to net zero by 2050 is a commitment of the Australian government that I made in Glasgow. It is the government's absolute policy.
But the impact of this is that the Coalition appears to be saying one thing in the bush and another in the cities. The political crime the Coalition accused Labor of at the last election. Liberal candidates facing independents in the so-called teal seats in the cities don't seem to have been told there is wiggle room in the policy. Trent Zimmerman, who is under threat in North Sydney, said it was a, quote, binding commitment which the government should and will honour. Dave Sharma told his local paper in the electorate of Wentworth that he had personally, quote, delivered a binding agreement to net zero emissions by 2050 and an upgraded 2030 emissions reduction target. Barnaby Joyce is a problem for the Coalition in these seats, with independents arguing that a vote for the Liberal candidate is a vote for Joyce.
Labor would govern with the Greens, and it will be Greens that will be pulling Labor's strings. They'll certainly never be pulling my strings, ever. The garlic, where's that coming from?
But the PM's headache now is the opposite. Labor and others are casting the Liberal Party as a hostage to a minor party which has clearly been pulling the climate policy strings.
They look fantastic.
Both the News Poll and Ipsos polls published in the last 24 hours show no significant change in the major party standing since the beginning of the campaign, meaning Labor remains in front, despite all the escalating rhetoric, despite the missteps.
This is going to take us like half an hour to ring this up, mate.
It's not a good time for a government's record to be coming under question.
While the China-Solomon Islands security agreement has featured heavily in the federal election campaign, one aspect has been largely overlooked by Australian politicians. That is what the agreement means for Solomon Islanders. While the government argues the China deal will lead to greater internal security, not everyone's convinced, as Peter McCutcheon reports.
The Solomon Islands is a nation with a history of instability. Riots in the capital of Honiara last November prompted Australia to send police and defence personnel to restore order again after a previous intervention ended in 2017.
That's an important relationship between Solomon Islands and Australia, and one which I am certain a lot of Solomon Islanders are very appreciative of.
But in the aftermath of the November riots, it became clear these tensions, although still related to deep-seated problems of development and unemployment, had a new element.
I think the fundamental difference was the China factor in the discussion.
Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare cut ties with Taiwan and recognised China in 2019. A move that was and still is opposed by the provincial government of the country's most populous island of Malaita.
It wasn't so much ethnic, it was more derived from this sentiment of autonomy and democracy that they've continued to champion as their primary rationale.
And China's growing economic presence in this Pacific country has been a continuing source of domestic tension.
The whole thing is about the leader of the opposition and who else on the other side of the house wanting to be prime minister. That's what it is. You want to sit here?
And so what you saw, I think, is to a certain extent, yes, disagreement over geopolitics, but also an appropriation of these international relations issues to express domestic political differences.
Over the past 18 months, China has also been helping the Solomons with its internal security, including the training of local police. But the leaking of a draft agreement 4 weeks ago revealed this relationship was going to a whole new level, opening the way for a Chinese police and military presence in the Pacific nation.
The Solomon Islands-China agreement is so broad and in some cases vague that you could interpret it in a lot of ways. And I'm not sure whether that was done intentionally or it just happened to be what it is.
Since the leaking of the original draft, both China and the Solomons have explicitly ruled out the building of a military base.
We are not pressured. We are not pressured in any way by our new friends. And there is no intention whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, to ask China to build a military base in Solomon Islands.
But there's plenty of other options that could concern Australia.
When we talk about a red line, that a base would be crossing the red line, we've really moved the goalpost way, way down the track. There are a lot of preliminary steps that can be taken, and that's the point about the agreement.
I'm not sure China wants to build a military base if it can have access to the Solomons in other ways that does not require a military base.
China's growing presence in the Solomons raises questions about the effectiveness of Australia's foreign policy. The Morrison government has rejected opposition claims that cuts to foreign aid helped push Honiara closer to Beijing. And Australia remains by far the Solomons' biggest aid provider.
I don't think Australia has done anything wrong. I think, this decision was taken by the Solomon Islands government. And I think part of the decision is to play off the powers that are out there. And they are aware of the geopolitical competition.
There are also questions about how Solomon Islanders will react to a greater Chinese police and military presence.
There will be a lot of pushback from within the Solomons. And we have an election in 2023, although the government's trying to push it back another year. And although international relations issues do not often feature in Solomon Islands elections, this could be different.
We find that it's a very divisive agreement now in the Solomon Islands. The National Council of Women, for example, have come out recently and said they're totally opposed to it.
China has entered uncharted waters in the Pacific, securing a broad, ambitious agreement with a struggling nation that raises many more questions than it answers.
This agreement has warned the rest of the region, be careful of things like Chinese investments. They may, in the fullness of time, be wanting the same sort of special extraterritoriality, special protection for their aid projects and their economic investment in the other islands.
It's been more than a year since the Royal Commission handed down its report into Australia's aged care sector, but stories of understaffing, substandard care and COVID-19 deaths continue. Aged care is a significant election issue as the Fair Work Commission begins hearing a case for a pay rise for workers. Ellen Coulter reports.
In my current role, I work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It is very hard work.
Glenn O'Driscoll is a registered nurse. 730 first met him in January when he was part of a rapid response team travelling between aged care homes with COVID-19 outbreaks. He's still living out of his suitcase, helping plug staff shortages.
COVID has not gone away. It's still very much present in aged care at the moment. A lot of facilities that have had outbreaks in the past are now getting second outbreaks.
It's been over a year since the Royal Commission into Aged Care revealed stories of substandard care and found Australia's aged care system was understaffed with an underpaid and undertrained workforce. Glenn, who's a member and former branch secretary of the Nursing Union, says for staff, nothing's changed.
They work double shifts, they work overtime, they work extended shifts. They are tired, they are worn out. COVID has not created these workforce issues, it's exacerbated them.
Labor is making aged care a key election platform.
There you go.
Amid ongoing stories of understaffing and COVID-19 deaths in aged care. The Royal Commission made it clear the aged care sector needed to attract more nurses and care workers and recommended an increase to award wages.
Their pay rates are below their compatriots in disability services, the health sector and in areas like retail.
The government didn't accept the recommendation for a wage rise and didn't make a submission to the Fair Work Commission. The Commission starts hearings today into whether aged care workers under 3 awards should receive a pay increase of up to 25%. The Coalition has said it will ensure the Fair Work decision is honoured, but hasn't committed to fully funding it through government subsidies.
So what we say is there's an independent pricing authority that determines, based on all the input costs, what that increase in subsidy will be.
For a sector where 60% of residential aged care homes are in deficit at the moment, and basically 2/3 of all homes in regional Australia are in deficit, we can't afford a pay rise without the government fully funding it.
Labor has committed to fund whatever pay rise the independent umpire decides.
These people need and deserve a pay rise, and aged care is not going to get fixed without it. So from my perspective, Labor is just being realistic about that.
Anthony Albanese made aged care the centrepiece of his budget reply speech, promising $2.5 billion over 4 years for measures including better food, stricter reporting rules for providers and greater penalties for covering up abuse. Key to Labor's promises are 2 Royal Commission recommendations: having a round-the-clock registered nurse in every aged care home and making sure residents receive 215 minutes of care per day. In its response to the Royal Commission recommendations, the Coalition government committed to a registered nurse being on site 16 hours a day and promised 200 care minutes. But on the campaign trail, the government has hinted it's willing to go further.
We have accepted the recommendation of the Royal Commission for nursing staff to be on premise 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but we also accepted the Royal Commission's recommendation that it would take us until 2024 to be able to do this.
A key question for Labor has been where it will find the staff to meet its nursing and care minute commitments.
We can't just make nurses all of a sudden fall out of the sky and be able to go and meet a 24/7 commitment to have a nurse in every single aged care.
We'll need about, at full-time equivalent, somewhere in the order of 750 additional nurses in the sector. Most nurses in aged care work part-time, so it's somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 new people coming into the sector. This is eminently doable.
Hal Swearison, a former Keating government advisor who's now a professor of health policy with La Trobe University, says finding that many workers will be a challenge, but not impossible.
So if the Fair Work Commission makes a ruling soon that aged care staffing pay should go up and that staffing is paid for, that will make it more attractive to bring people into the aged care sector, and provided that funding is available, that should be manageable. But there are a fair few ifs in that equation.
Labor is also promising fee-free training places to boost the workforce. But Anthony Albanese today confirmed the party will also need to recruit overseas workers as a stopgap measure to meet its nursing promise. Nairi Morley has been in aged care for 6 years. She has dementia. Her daughter, Kylie Bennett, doesn't see her mum as much as she'd like because she also cares for her granddaughter who has autism.
If you plan on joining a safari, don't get dressed for going on a cruise.
Kylie took Nairi out for Mother's Day last year and says she noticed a small sore on her leg.
I let them know at the nursing home. They did ring me a couple of weeks later and said that they're looking after the wound and it's got a little bit bigger and they're going to dress it and give Mum some antibiotics.
Kylie said the wound had gotten worse when she saw her mum a few months later.
It was smelly and gapey and I was nearly vomited in the car park undoing the wound. I was so surprised that it had got this out of hand. They said that the wound had just got bigger and they were treating it with antibiotics.
Kylie complained to the aged care regulator about how Anglicare St Martin's nursing home managed her mother's wound and pain. She also complained that the home hadn't managed Nairi's changing behaviour properly, resulting in inadequate hygiene and infrequent showers.
When I started to give her a shower, I noticed all black on the back of her neck. They said that she was being very awkward and not wanting to have a shower, but I just can't understand why they wouldn't shower her.
The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission found the home did monitor and manage Ms Morley's wound and pain, but not at an expected level. It found there were delays in escalating the wound's changing condition to a GP and external wound care service, and the home didn't properly assess Ms Morley's pain levels. The regulator also found care and management of Kylie's mother's behavioural changes hadn't met expected standards, but the regulator said it was satisfied with actions that had been taken to improve care for Ms Morley and other residents. In a statement, Anglicare Southern Queensland said the issues raised by Kylie had been investigated and addressed, and since the complaint it had worked with Kylie, her mum and the regulator to ensure a high quality standard of care.
I know it's too late for my mum, but I just want everyone else to know that when you put your mum in a nursing home or your father or your loved ones, that you've got to keep an eye on what's going on.
Following the Royal Commission, the Coalition pledged $18.8 billion over 5 years to improve the sector. 7:30 requested an interview with Anne Ruston, who will take over from retiring MP Greg Hunt as Aged Care Minister if the Coalition is re-elected. The Coalition's campaign team said Senator Ruston isn't the Aged Care Minister, and neither Mr Hunt nor the Aged Care Services Minister Richard Colbeck were available. One of the Coalition's big spending promises was $6.5 billion to roll out 80,000 home care packages over 2 years. 32,000 of those had been released at the end of April, but more than 60,000 people are still on the wait list, with wait times up to 9 months.
So that's an improvement, so there's no doubt about that, but they're still massively unacceptable.
Labor has pledged to match the Coalition's promise on 80,000 extra home care packages.
The difference between Labor and the government is that right now there are no staff to deliver those home care packages.
The Royal Commission recommended the government look into an aged care levy to address chronic underfunding, something that's not palatable to either party this election.
So the community needs to bite the bullet on this. Either you fund this thing properly and you do require proper management, or you continue with a system which is always going to have quality problems, access problems, management problems as we've currently got.
The Royal Commission's been done and dusted for a long time, but on the floor, nothing has changed. Care workers are disillusioned. They have lost their faith in the government process, regardless of the party.
You can find full statements from Richard Colbeck and Anglicare Southern Queensland on our website. And if you have a story about the quality of food in aged care homes that you'd be willing to share, drop us a line at 7.30@abc.net.au. Tech billionaire Elon Musk has spent more than 60 billion Australian dollars to clinch a deal to take over social media platform Twitter. It's a curious business decision at face value, given the company hasn't reported a profit in 8 of the past 10 years. But as Michael Vincent reports, it's about more than just money.
News is out. Elon Musk to acquire Twitter.
It is now a done deal.
For an estimated $44 billion.
Silicon Valley mogul Elon Musk made his mark as co-founder of PayPal and is now best known for his twin tech triumphs, SpaceX rockets and Tesla electric cars.
But we did bring sexy back.
He was named Time's 2021 Person of the Year.
I think anyone who's sort of doing things that are really useful to the rest of humanity is, I admire them greatly.
Now he's poised to take control of what he's dubbed the global public square, social media giant Twitter.
So it's been used quite effectively as sort of a loudspeaker, if you will, for a lot of politicians to get their message across because it's very shareable material.
Donald Trump's voracious use of Twitter allowed him to bypass the mainstream media to win the presidency in 2016.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
But in 2021, Twitter permanently banned him from the platform, blaming him for inciting the January 6 riots at the Capitol building.
Trump he had his account blocked for a while. They decided ultimately to block him completely.
Twitter management said Trump had breached the company's terms, but critics accused the company of censoring Trump. Elon Musk was one of them.
Well, I think it's very important for there to be an inclusive arena for free speech, where Twitter has become kind of the de facto town square. It's just really important that people have both the reality and the perception that they are able to speak freely within the bounds of the law.
Musk has his limits when it comes to what goes on Twitter, reportedly angry that a Twitter account was created that followed the movements of his private jet.
Is it selective privacy or is it privacy for everyone?
Musk has also blocked other Twitter users whose opinions he's disagreed with.
His behaviour on the platform hasn't exactly itself been exemplary. But Elon Musk has a habit of blocking and being actually quite nasty to anybody who doesn't agree with him on the platform.
Dr. Jennifer Beckett is a specialist in social media and online communities.
He has, said some very questionable things around COVID and COVID vaccine misinformation. And I think that that's a real problem because that's a civic issue. That goes to an issue of public safety and is actually in breach of a lot of what Twitter has now put in place to protect those kinds of things. And I think that anybody who sort of touts free speech without considering the harms that some of that speech can do is always going to be a cause for concern.
We would also be concerned if the way in which free speech is used to justify behaviour for those who already have power to then use that freedom of speech to aggressively go after those without power. Similarly, if it is used with a chilling effect to, for example, target and exact revenge on those who personally insult Mr. Musk. If we saw behaviour such as banning or restricting or otherwise retaliating against people who perhaps insult him or call into question his business practices, then that would be another major red flag.
US President Joe Biden flagged a crackdown on social media during his State of the Union. But today the White House was mute on the subject of Musk's Twitter purchase.
What I can tell you as a general matter, no matter who owns or runs Twitter, the president has long been concerned about the power of large social media platforms, the power they have over our everyday lives, has long argued that tech platforms must be held accountable for the harms they cause.
Elon Musk reportedly spent $21 billion of his own cash to help make this purchase. But in the world of social media, Facebook's users are measured in billions, Twitter's users in hundreds of millions. It's ranked 15 out of the world's top social media companies. And for a company that's not regularly making money, it's a huge investment for what appears to be a personal cause.
This is not a way to sort of make money. You know, I think this is. It's just that I think this is. This could. My strong intuitive sense is that having a public platform that is maximally trusted and broadly inclusive is extremely important to the future of civilization.
But you've described yourself.
I don't care about the economics at all.
That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.
See the bullet holes all over the wall.
It's the show where anything can happen.
We are taking back the power.
As we get closer to the separatists, the military is on alert.
This is the latest murder to have happened here.
Two ABC powerhouses in one night.
All the big issues, no small talk.
To tell the best stories.
Reconnecting you to the rest of the world.
From home and right across the globe.
We've been allowed here to witness an extraordinary awakening.
Foreign Correspondent, followed by Q&A. Thursdays from 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Justice and humanity.
Economic growth.
Champions. Women have been great role models.
The city has been in lockdown.
This is DW News live from Berlin. A U-turn from Berlin on sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. After heavy criticism, Germany vows to deliver anti-aircraft systems to the Ukrainian military for the first time. Defence Minister Christine Lambrecht says more support is on the way. Also coming up, military leaders from some 40 countries meet in Germany to try to help Ukraine's military fend off the Russian invasion. The US Defence Secretary says allies will, quote, keep moving heaven and earth to supply Kyiv. And the UN Secretary-General tries mediating with Moscow over Ukraine. Antonio Guterres meets Russia's foreign minister ahead of talks with Vladimir Putin. I'm Anya Coopers-McKinnon. Welcome to the show. The US says America and its allies will hold monthly meetings to discuss ongoing military support to Ukraine. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin made the announcement after hosting a meeting of military leaders from over 40 countries at the Ramstein Air Base here in Germany. Now, the summit on arming Ukraine also saw Germany announce a major policy reversal. Berlin says it will send anti-aircraft systems to Ukraine for the first time.
Fresh from his visit to Kyiv, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin welcomed military leaders from across the world to Ramstein.
It is an extraordinary gathering with more than 40 countries represented here today. And we're here to help Ukraine win the fight against Russia's unjust invasion and to build up Ukraine's defenses for tomorrow's challenges.
The meeting kicked off with a surprise. In a notable policy shift, Germany, which had been criticized for refusing to send heavy weapons to Ukraine, announced it would now send Gepard anti-aircraft guns.
That's precisely what Ukraine needs right now to secure its airspace from the ground. That's been made clear again here today. Germany is ready and willing. Over the course of the conference, we'll be looking into further possibilities to continue supporting Ukraine in this courageous and important fight for freedom and peace.
Not everyone in Berlin welcomed the decision. I find it problematic. Germany doesn't even have enough military equipment for itself in the case of Putin totally losing control.
I think it's important. I also think that what the German government is doing is good. But I am also not sure if offering weapons is actually going to stop the war.
I didn't like the degree of hesitancy. In the end, I would actually be for aggressive weapons, so heavier machinery. In his closing remarks, Austin said the gathering between the US and its allies will not be the last. Once a month, they'll meet to discuss Ukraine's defense needs to help them fight the Russian invasion.
We can cross now to DW political correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, who's near the Ramstein airbase in Germany, where the meeting took place. Benjamin, how has Germany's announcement of providing anti-aircraft systems to Ukraine been received? How's it gone down there?
Definitely better than in Berlin, if we just consider those voices that we heard who voiced criticism. In here, the Secretary of Defense called Germany an ally and a friend and praised this, what he called was significant, that Germany is supplying these heavy weapons. There had been pressure growing on the government, not only by the Conservative Party, but also within the government, with the Free Business FDP party and the Greens calling for these heavy weapons. It's not surprisingly that this announcement happened before these high-level delegations met here in Ramstein in southern Germany. There was media report by German media Süddeutsche Zeitung who said that Germany will send these tanks with these anti-aircraft capacities. So all in all, here in Ramstein, it was happiness and relief that Germany is finally taking this step.
Now, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that these meetings will now take place every month. How significant is that?
What they wanted to show today here is unity. They are talking not only to NATO members, they are talking to all allies all around the world. And that's why the US also made this meeting here. This was not under the umbrella of NATO. More people in more countries were also invited, Finland, Sweden, to show that they want to counter Russia's aggression together. And that's what they also praised, what Germany is doing, what Canada is doing, the US also sending and supplying these weapons. And the meeting today comes after Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State of the US went to Ukraine, went to Kyiv, met with President Zelensky and said that they will help with providing more weapons to Ukraine to defend itself, not only now, but also when it comes to the security concerns after this war that, according to the US and according to Ukraine, will be won by Ukraine. So a strong signal towards Moscow that they will act together, and with Germany, with this huge paradigm shift that means sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. But for Ukraine, for the US and for many allies, this is a step that was long overdue.
All right, DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, thanks so much. I'm joined now by DW's chief political editor Michaela Küffner. Michaela, tell us what has brought about this really very significant change in policy.
Well, quite clearly, it was internal and external pressure. We've had quite a debate here in Germany over the past couple of weeks, with two of the three coalition parties actually continuing to criticize Chancellor Olaf Scholz for not interpreting his Zeitenwende, the full turnaround, as backing Ukraine with everything Germany has, including everything German industry has. And now we see the pledge by the German Defense Minister Lamprecht saying that some 50 of those cheetah tanks that are anti-air craft missiles, capable and armed vehicles being sent to Ukraine. From the outside, it is giving into pressure. On the inside, it actually is quite a turnaround in itself for the German armed forces. So I would expect that to be the beginning of new thinking on that.
Does Berlin actually believe that Ukraine can win this war against Russia?
Let's put it this way. Germany, Berlin, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, didn't believe that Russia would actually attack, like most countries, although even while the US were already warning of an imminent attack, Germany still believed it wouldn't happen. Then we saw German Chancellor Olaf Scholz say that Russia must not win this war. We are yet to hear that Ukraine must win this war. There seems to be consensus that it must not lose it completely. It must not be erased from the map. Ukrainian identity must not disappear. But there's a continuing internal debate, particularly in the party of the German Chancellor, of what that means in concrete terms.
Just how damaging has this perceived hesitation, this foot-dragging by Chancellor Scholz been for Germany's standing within the European Union?
It's been quite damaging, and particularly when you look at Eastern countries like Poland with very close historical ties, Germany always being a champion for Poland being brought further into the Union. The Baltic countries have a lot of doubts. Then Germany took a long time to actually back off from that controversial pipeline, Nord Stream 2. It is also still one of the countries that is against a full oil and gas embargo because it would hit Germany so hard. So clearly the German Chancellor is not perceived to be the one in the lead on the European side, and that really has damaged Germany's reputation, still the strongest economy in the EU, as a leader in this geostrategic struggle.
And politically at home, I mean, how unified is this this move and these, as we've been seeing, sort of a very new perspective on Germany's sort of military involvement? How much unity is there within the German government and German political parties?
On the one hand, there's a striking amount of unity. We are still rubbing our eyes and ears here as correspondents that particularly the Greens very early on came round pro-delivery of weapons, pro-delivery of heavy weapons, being very vocal about it. At the same time, it's the Social Democrats who are still struggling to break with what many see as a pro-Russian past, embodied by the last Social Democrat Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who is still on the payroll of Vladimir Putin.
We saw a few weeks ago Gerhard Schröder travelling to Moscow and meeting with Putin in an attempt to maybe change his mind. I mean, how was that seen here? How was that seen here in Berlin and also internationally?
Well, he is an odd character. His own party is increasingly calling on him to leave the party, to step down from a role. He will eventually be excluded from the Social Democrats. I think there's no doubt about it. It really is a heavy historical burden now for the Social Democrats here, who are still struggling to prove that they can be as decisive as their own coalition and many Western partners would like them to be.
Our Chief Political Editor, Michaela Küffner. Many thanks. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has proposed setting up a UN-led humanitarian contact group in Ukraine to protect civilians. Now, the goal would be to set up safe corridors for civilians with the help of Russia and Ukraine. Guterres was speaking in Moscow following talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The UN chief has faced criticism for failing to take a lead in peace talks earlier in the conflict. Ukraine's president also criticised Guterres for visiting Moscow before travelling to Kyiv, saying it sent the wrong signal. Now, Guterres used his visit to put pressure on Moscow over war crimes allegations, but emphasised that the most important task is to put an end to the war.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations. But it is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond. The United Nations has repeatedly called for ceasefires to protect civilians and to facilitate a political dialogue to reach a solution. So far, that has not been possible.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow was open to ending the conflict, but he accused Ukraine of undermining negotiations by bypassing the UN's conflict resolution procedures.
We do have to accept the truth as it is. Either we agree on having solutions being taken only within our own group of followers, taking decisions how the world should live, or we should talk to each other. Nobody wants war. But always just giving arguments and it is also necessary to call these to responsibility who have violated the Charter of the United Nations.
Now, DW correspondent Yuri Roshetto is covering those meetings, and I asked him for his view on the talks.
Well, the meeting between Lavrov and Guterres was, of course, a meeting between two diplomats, and that was very clear, especially with Antonio Guterres, who was very polite at the joint press conference. Lavrov, on the other hand, was more direct and used the opportunity to use the same tricks as so often when meeting with Western colleagues. The most concrete thing that came out of the joint press conference was Guterres' proposal to set up a contact group consisting of the UN, Ukraine and Russia that could coordinate the humanitarian corridors for civilians in Ukraine, especially for the people in the occupied city of Mariupol.
Guterres actually said that he was traveling in the capacity of a messenger of peace. I mean, you said that there were concrete possibilities discussed, but do you think this has actually achieved anything?
Well, I believe the most important diplomatic goal has been achieved. Guterres was heard. I want to point to the fact that he spoke out very clearly about the war during the press conference, a word that no Russian or foreign person is in Russia allowed to say. Of course, we don't know what else the two ultimately said behind closed doors, but I think that Russia is conceding, at least partially, by setting up a joint contact group under the leadership of the UN for the evacuation of the population. This can also be interpreted as a positive sign because it offers the Russians a kind of exit strategy from their disaster in Ukraine, which is a military, domestic and geopolitical disaster. Russian state propaganda can present this as a generous gesture of goodwill by Vladimir Putin, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the Kremlin uses this compromise for its own purposes, if it ultimately leads to the saving of human lives. And this is exactly what Guterres wanted to achieve as a peacemaker.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Yuri Roshetto in Riga. Many thanks. Now, in Ukraine itself, volunteers are working to evacuate thousands of civilians in the east living with daily and nightly Russian artillery shelling. They're hiding out in basements and shelters, many without electricity, gas or water.
This man is being evacuated from his home in Kharkiv. Trapped in his flat, it is a miracle he survived.
They've been bombarding us all day and all night. In the beginning, it was quieter at night. The bombing only happened during the day. But later, they began bombing at night, too. Bombs hit here in the yard.
Kharkiv has endured a barrage of Russian attacks. Constant shelling has reduced much of the city to ashes. Now, some 50 residents have been evacuated from one frontline neighborhood. They have been taken to shelters where they hope to be safe. About 400 kilometers south, safety is still a distant dream. Russian forces continue to pummel the Azovstal steel factory, the last pocket of resistance in Mariupol. The port city has been under siege for weeks now. Most of it has been wiped out by Russian bombardment. The dire fate of Mariupol has been a warning to other Ukrainian cities. To protect them, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked allies for more support.
Everyone in the world, even those who openly did not support us, now agrees that the fate of Europe, the fate of global security, and the fate of the democratic system is being decided in Ukraine.
And it seems like his calls for greater diplomatic efforts are being heard, with dozens of nations willing to support Ukraine in a war that it simply cannot win on its own.
It has been very well received here in Ukraine. As you know, President Zelensky has been pushing for this for a long time. He says Ukraine has very great soldiers, has a very high morale, but it needs more heavy equipment. So Germany has really come under a lot of pressure in this regard, not only from Ukraine, but also from other countries. So, of course, Ukrainians expect still more weapons from Germany, but they see it as a step in the right direction. Let's listen ourselves to what some of the Ukrainians have to say.
We know that Germany's position regarding Ukraine is ambiguous. There are a lot of questions to ask Mr. Scholz, but we totally support the fact that German society is putting pressure on the German government to help Ukraine, in particular with heavy weapons.
I was quite disappointed by the time which Germany took to make this decision. Because, as I said, I believe the time is a priority now, because every day our people are dying, and on these tanks, on this hard weapon depends the life of our citizens.
Jan-Philipp, police in the Moldovan separatist region of Transnistria have reported new explosions there this morning. Moscow has troops stationed there. Can you tell us what we know about that?
Yes, the recent attacks in the pro-Russian separatist region of Transnistria have started to worry many people here in Ukraine. Of course, it's not a good sign. Some security analysts say that it might be false flag attacks by the Russians, who want to find a pretext to send more troops into this region. It's officially part of Moldova, but it has been dominated by pro-Russian separatists for a long time, and Russian senior military official recently said that they want to create a corridor in Ukraine, in southern Ukraine, to connect Russia with Moldova, with the separatist region of Transnistria. So this would give, of course, Russia more geostrategic options also in the current war in Ukraine.
The UN Secretary-General is in Moscow today. Does the government in Kyiv hold out any hope that Antonio Guterres will be able to achieve anything there in his talks?
To be honest, I don't think the expectations are very high. Ukraine is involved in very heavy fighting in the east of the country, in the south of the country, and the options for diplomatic solutions from the side of the Ukrainians, at least, they don't look very optimistic at the moment. However, some of the UN Secretary General's words in Moscow were well received, some of his very open words, even though President Zelensky repeatedly said that he thinks it's a mistake that he first visited Moscow before coming to Kiev in 2 days. But what was definitely well received here in Ukraine was the Secretary General's announcement that the UN will help to create humanitarian corridors in Mariupol to help evacuate civilians. This is something that the Ukrainians have demanded for a while now.
Jan-Philipp Scholz in Lviv, thanks so much. Now, the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are also being felt by farmers in Africa. Plants need 3 basic ingredients in fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Now, Russia is a top supplier of all 3. The conflict is creating scarcity for farmers and is fueling rising food costs. Nigeria is now looking to diversify. DW's Amake Okoye reports.
James Chukwudi's business is large-scale farming. He grows maize, cassava, and yams and other food crops. So he depends heavily on fertilizers to boost his harvest. Getting enough of it was never a problem for the farmer.
Typically, Chukwudi sources his fertilizers directly from Russia. But since the Russia-Ukraine invasion, he's not able to do that. He now sources these fertilizers locally. But though they are locally sourced, the prices have now doubled.
Last year, I could buy conveniently, without even thinking twice, I could buy 150 bags of fertilizer. But right now, I only have 70 bags of fertilizer due to the change in price. And whether I like it or not, I just have to source for money to actually get more fertilizers to accomplish all what I'm doing here. So it's really affecting me negatively.
Chukwudi says he has no choice but to increase the price of his farm produce, meaning that the rising costs will hit the price of food Nigerians are putting on their tables. International sanctions mean Russia is no longer an option for Nigerian farmers as a source of fertilizers components.
Because of the problems now, because of the blockade, even if you go to Russia now, you cannot get anything. So Nigeria and many other countries are seeking alternatives to going to Russia. Some other countries are going to other countries to buy. We are looking inwards. As a matter of fact, we must look inwards.
Just a month ago, Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, opened the continent's largest fertilizer plant in Lagos. It has the capacity to produce 3 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer every year.
The new plant will make Nigeria self-sufficient in fertilizer production with excess capacity to export to other African markets and the rest of the world. Our products have already reached African markets and some to the United States, Brazil, India, and Mexico.
Dangote's production may counter fertilizer scarcity in Nigeria, but for now, the prices remain too high for farmers like Chukwudi to afford.
People in the Chinese capital, Beijing, are rushing to stock up on groceries and household goods as COVID-19 case numbers there increase. They fear authorities will lock the city down under China's strict zero-COVID policy as the country struggles with its worst outbreak for 2 years.
Rushing to be ready in the event of a lockdown. These are just some of the millions of residents stockpiling essentials after authorities sparked fears of an impending lockdown. Government assurances that there is enough food have done little to dissuade cautious locals, with queues forming outside some supermarkets. While in others, aisles ended up nearly bare of sought-after products like fresh meat. Supermarket chains have boosted stock levels and extended opening hours in a bid to keep up with the increased demand. But some locals are anxious about the future. We're afraid that if deliveries are cut off, supplies won't meet demand. Seeing so many people buying food at the same time made me a little nervous, but actually the situation is still okay. Only 70 COVID cases have been discovered in the city of 21 million since the outbreak was first detected on Friday. But authorities have responded with the same strict zero-COVID toolkit China has used throughout the pandemic. Mass testing is already underway here in Beijing's biggest district, where most of the cases have been found and where some residential compounds have already been placed under lockdown. Officials say testing will be expanded to all but 5 of the city's remaining districts on Tuesday. Residents will be hoping that a Shanghai-style lockdown won't be next, but until they know more, many will keep preparing for the worst.
A quick reminder of the top stories that we're following for you today. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has applauded international support for Ukraine and announced the US and its allies will meet monthly to coordinate military aid to Kyiv. Austin was speaking after hosting a meeting of military leaders from more than 40 countries at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. And the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow in a bid to mediate in the Ukraine conflict. Later, he'll hold talks with President Vladimir Putin. You're watching DW News. Coming up next in DW News Asia, why China is officially pushing traditional Chinese medicine as a treatment for COVID-19. That and more coming up next with my colleague Biresh Banerjee. Thanks so much for watching DW.
From Pussy Riot to exile, the Russians leaving in protest at Putin's war.
My hope is that somebody from Putin's circle just will kill him.
Tens of thousands of Russians have fled here to Georgia, all wondering how they can oppose this war and when or if they can ever go home.
He looks like a person who doesn't have access to the right information.
He has lost the connection with the reality.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Mysterious, suspenseful, thrilling. New drama on ABC iView.
Who are you?
I'm a bad person who's trying to be good.
What you did dishonors all cops.
When a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master.
There's been a report of inappropriate behavior.
This life, this is all we need. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone.
To stream the best drama for free, log in to ABC iView.
It's on.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
After the last 2 years, we could all do with a bit of a boost. And a COVID-19 booster, it boosts more than just your immunity.
It's a boost to my bottom line.
A boost to my confidence.
Boost to my fitness.
A boost to our social life.
A boost to my happiness.
Give yourself a boost and keep up to date with your vaccinations by visiting australia.gov.au. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Police say Mr. Justice Opaz was shot with a .22 calibre weapon.
The Parramatta blast shattered brickwork in the forecourt of the empty family court building.
Who premeditated and pre-planned the crimes.
This series of crimes is unparalleled in Australian history.
Len turned around and said, I can shoot you anytime I want to.
The Family Court Murders starts Tuesday, May 10 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Tracy and I, we're building a future. We're selling an idea of summers that never end. The company is called Lightwave, and we're making board shorts.
It is my company, Trotter.
Snapper's building an empire.
Wait, this isn't what I came for.
I'm coming home, I'm coming home, I'm coming home to you tonight.
When did all this stop being fun?
Barons. Stream the series on ABC iView.
A boost to foreign aid. Labor unveils its plan to fight China's influence in the Pacific. April rains in Queensland trigger flash flooding in the north and jubilation in the west. Creating a stink, the Queensland Council turning human waste into renewable energy. And a milestone for Target Tasmania, an event changed by tragedy. This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Tyne Logan. China's sudden security incursion into Solomon Islands has prompted Labor to step forward with its own plan for the Pacific. The package of foreign aid, defence training and extra Australian broadcasting is meant to counter what it calls the biggest security blunder by this country since World War II. But Scott Morrison's shrugged it off as a Labor rerun of schemes the government's already doing. Political editor Andrew Probyn has more.
When being Prime Minister requires a soft touch.
A bit delicate.
They are very delicate, aren't they? But if you think making macarons is difficult, there we go. Healing relations with a Macron will be trickier.
I wish him every congratulations for what is an historic victory for President Macron.
Hello, how are you? Andrew Probyn from the ABC. The re-elected French president who had a spectacular falling out with Scott Morrison over a cancelled submarine contract.
Do you think he lied to you? I don't think. I know.
Will be critical in a coordinated response to Beijing's influence in the Indo-Pacific, where France has more than 1 million citizens. China's striking of a military pact with the Solomons of major embarrassment to Scott Morrison's so-called Pacific step-up.
The bloke who just keeps dropping the ball, the bloke who went missing while China negotiated and signed a security deal on our doorstep.
Labor revealing the approach it would take to make Australia the Pacific partner of choice. An extra $500 million in aid over 4 years, 3,000 permanent migration spots for Pacific Islanders, allowing seasonal workers to bring their families, financing climate and clean energy projects and extending the reach of ABC broadcasts.
I sent in the AFP. The Labor Party wants to send in the ABC. They have a Q&A solution in the Pacific.
Although the PM is refusing to say what he would do if the Chinese established a military base on the Solomons, which he said on the weekend was a red line.
No responsible Prime Minister would go into the sort of detail that you're asking for.
No point in beating your chest if you're beaten to the punch.
Where's that coming from?
On climate, the coalition's accused of sending conflicting messages to rural and city constituents. Queensland Senator Matt Canavan dismissing the government's net zero emissions plan.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway.
Its candidate in the Queensland seat of Flynn describing the government's net zero emissions by 2050 commitment as flexible.
Our candidate in Flynn was talking about is how we get there. He wasn't talking about the commitment himself.
Labor too having to explain how coal production won't be affected by its push to penalise major emitters.
No coal project will face a carbon constraint that is beyond, that will make them internationally uncompetitive.
Scott Morrison's embrace of net zero by 2050 constrains coalition attacks on Labor over climate change. And the Beijing blindside in the Solomons also blunts any government boast on national security. Not that this is stopping them. The PM and his ministers continue to talk tough on China. But if the government's rhetoric was matched by actual defence capability, Australia would have one of the world's strongest militaries. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
The divide over climate change policy hurt Labor last election. This time around, both parties are struggling to overcome internal disagreements and to control their messaging. Here's data analyst Casey Briggs.
When it comes to staying on message on coal and climate change, the coalition's got some problems. This is Colin Boyce. He's the LNP's candidate for the regional Queensland seat of Flynn.
Zero net carbon emissions by 2050. Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room.
The coalition's division goes all the way to the top. The PM and the Nationals' deputy leader talking completely at odds.
Our commitment to net zero by 2050 is a commitment of the Australian government that I made in Glasgow. It is the government's absolute policy.
The net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson's said he's pausing the net zero commitment. Germany's building coal and gas infrastructure. Italy's reopening coal-fired power plants. It's all over.
The seat Colin Boyce is trying to win is home to about 1/10 of all of Australia's coal mining jobs. And this is a part of the country that Labor had deep troubles in 3 years ago. Remember the Stop Adani convoy? didn't really do any favours for Labor in this seat. And so this time, the opposition's trying not to repeat some of those same mistakes. Here is its candidate for Flynn in 2022.
They wouldn't say coal. That was the issue. I will say it, and I'll say it every day.
But head 1,600 kilometres south, where Labor's more worried about losing votes to the left than it is to the right, and there, the message is pretty different. This is Labor's candidate for Melbourne talking about higher renewable energy targets. And here's MP for McNamara, Josh Burns, talking about a quick transition away from fossil fuels. So Labor still has seats where that climate coal messaging is butting heads in different parts of the country. What's new, though, is that the Coalition have some of those seats as well, defending ones in regional Queensland and some of these inner city seats, seats like Wentworth and seats like North Sydney, where the candidates are posting messages like this online in support of the net zero target. It's a big country. These are broad churches of political parties, and sometimes that makes staying on message hard.
The CEO of Guide Dogs Victoria has been stood down after appearing in election campaign ads endorsing the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. An independent investigation has been launched after Karen Hayes featured in letterbox flyers handed out in the seat of Kooyong and in social media campaigns. Guide Dogs Victoria says the board had no knowledge of the ads and did not endorse them. Charities can be disqualified for promoting political parties or candidates. New South Wales teachers have voted to walk off the job next week for 24 hours, citing crippling workloads, poor salaries and chronic staff shortages as the reasons. They say the current pay offer just isn't enough.
Classrooms. They are fundamental to children's education.
We need to get that built as soon as possible.
As the state government planned the future of school construction, a more pressing problem loomed above.
A crisis in New South Wales. It's a teacher shortage crisis.
So today what we're going to do in maths is we're actually going
to... The Teachers Federation says the 2.5% pay rise offered by the government will do nothing to solve that crisis. So public school teachers across the state will strike next Wednesday.
Teacher shortage is being caused by uncompetitive salaries, salaries that have declined relative to other degreed professions over the last 30 years, and crippling workload.
Here in New South Wales at 2.5%, we have the highest pay rises of any state in Australia. But where we can do more, we will. We'll continue to work through those issues and get a good outcome.
Parents are being warned to plan for disruption.
I think it's really difficult for working parents. They don't really know where to send their kids.
When you homeschool, you actually appreciate how much work the teachers actually do.
This disruption on the 4th of May pales into insignificance compared to the daily disruption being experienced in our school due to teacher shortages.
You know, it's been a very disruptive 2 years for our parents and for our students, and that's why it's disappointing that they're choosing to strike.
The Teachers Federation is upping the stakes with this latest round of industrial action. In addition to next week's strike, teachers are now authorised to walk off the job if a government MP visits a public school. A hearing in the Industrial Relations Commission has been set for early May. Jake Lapham, ABC News, Sydney.
An Adelaide stripper claims she was fired after raising concerns about a colleague's alleged sexual assault while working. She's now suing her former workplace and challenging her classification as a contractor in the Employment Tribunal. Gabriella Marchant reports.
A colleague of mine was sexually assaulted at the club. There was no security up there. She was quite literally trapped. I raised it with management and then I didn't really see any evidence of any kind of follow-up.
Stripper Luna claims she was dismissed from Adelaide strip club The Firm after raising workplace safety concerns over her colleague's alleged assault. She's now suing her former workplace in the SA Employment Tribunal, which The Firm is contesting.
They just cut all contact with me without any notice or explanation.
The firm says a WorkSafe SA inspection found it complied with relevant legislation and rejects that dancers are ever blamed for sexual misconduct. Luna also wants the tribunal to rule she's an employee, not a contractor.
They want to be able to dictate when we work and how we work, but then they also don't want to be liable for us.
The dancers allege it's standard for clubs to withhold pay via so-called fines.
Common fines that we would see in the industry would be if we're late, if we don't roster onto a shift that the club would like us to roster onto, if we're sick too many times in a given period.
The firm says dancers are well remunerated and classifying them as employees wouldn't be accurate. It says strippers can work dates and times they choose, but concedes once they commit to a shift, they're expected to attend. The dancers say historical stigma disempowers dancers in the industry.
One of my favourite quotes from a manager is, "A new girl turns 18 every day."
Luna says if clubs won't engage them as employees, they should allow dancers to truly work as contractors like in the ACT, where laws allow sexual touching.
Strippers there are at liberty to offer dancers that have a certain amount of more interpersonal contact. What the stripper would earn it's all theirs.
Luna's case will be heard in the Employment Tribunal this week. Gabriella Marchant, ABC News, Adelaide.
Russia has warned there is a real threat of World War III breaking out if the West continues to supply weapons to Ukraine. The Kremlin unleashed attacks on 5 railway stations to disrupt supplies of foreign weapons to the front in eastern Ukraine. And while the battle for Donbass rages on, ruined towns around the capital, Kyiv, are starting to rebuild. Europe correspondent Nick Dole reports from Irpin.
Much of the damage in Ukraine is of Russia's making, but what happened to the bridge at Irpin was self-inflicted. Ukraine blew it up to stop Russia's advance into the capital. But a new river crossing's already been built so that people aren't cut off. In a nearby hospital, staff are replacing the walls and windows that were blown out by Russian shelling. During the attack last month, the staff here lived in the basement and worked around the clock so they could treat people who'd been injured. Some patients who didn't make it are buried in a yard out the back. They'll have to be exhumed.
This is our city and it will be rebuilt. This clinic is needed because people are coming back. We shouldn't need to wait until the end of the war.
A massive effort is underway to clear the streets. Those who've returned to Irpin who can't find their cars come here.
So, Sergei, this is your car up here. What on earth happened to it, do you think?
Yes, that's my car, he says. It was destroyed by a shell.
It's confronting enough individually, but when you see all these cars that have been shelled or shot at, it gives you a real sense of just how much destruction there was. And this is just in one part of the neighbourhood. And here are some of the vehicles that haven't caught fire, and that's where you can see some of the most horrific detail. Look at this. This car would have offered almost no protection from this blast. You can see inside the upholstery's been torn through. Some of the shrapnel looks like it's gone right through it. And over here on the windscreen of this four-wheel drive, someone's written children. A parent has tried to warn the Russians that there are kids inside the car. And gazing through here, I can see a baby seat in the front. But despite that, this windscreen is still riddled with bullets.
Just up the road, Alexander's returned home to see the damage a tank did to his apartment block. He's still hoping to bring his wife and children back here.
We want to stay. We only want to live in Irpin.
His neighbour downstairs, Luba, returned to find her roof had caught fire. She's trying to make it livable again.
Yes, of course it's hard. There's no water or electricity, but this is my apartment, my home. I had no idea how much I loved my home until now.
With the Russians driven out of this region, people here are appreciating home that little bit more. It's not how they left it, but this land is still theirs. Nick Dole, ABC News, Irpin.
Townsville has recorded its wettest April in more than 2 decades after heavy rain drenched the region and caused flash flooding. It was an anxious wait for some as backyards went underwater. But out in Western Queensland, the final burst of wet season has been cause for celebration.
Swapping cars for kayaks as streets turn to streams, these Townsville locals are soaking up their new waterfront views.
We're used to it. Been here 25 years, so yeah, it's fun.
Dirrigan has been drenched with almost 300 millimetres of rain in 24 hours, among the heaviest falls in Townsville. Julia Lowe's home is surrounded by floodwaters.
At the back of my house, it's about 5 foot, I suppose. So we've actually got a deck for the clothesline and it's like my own little personal jetty at the minute.
Some, like Earl Tutt, are on edge. He's still scarred by the 2019 floods, which inundated his home.
A nervous or anxious wait to see just how deep it was going to get.
It's been an unseasonably late burst of wet weather, leaving parks, playgrounds, bridges and roads underwater.
For Townsville, that was its heaviest April rainfall since 2000.
The local SES has received more than 30 calls for help. Swiftwater crews were called to rescue a woman trapped on the other side of this flooded road.
We brought another casualty out last night, had a medical condition, assisted them, but then the water started rising and because it was dark, it was a bit dangerous to bring them out at 2:30 this morning.
For kids like Mason, the flooding has meant a day off school, but he's not too bothered.
It's horrible and I want to go fishing in it.
This is the main road out of Townsville, cut off by fast-flowing floodwaters from the Bowley River after heavy rain in the catchment. It's been a headache for drivers, but for most, the wet weather has been welcome. It's a similar story in the Burdekin, where the Horton River catchment hit major flood levels. In Western Queensland, the unexpected drenching has closed roads and filled up parched dams and creeks. Graziers are rejoicing after a failed summer wet season.
It's beautiful water, lovely rain. Yep, it'll set us up nicely for winter. It was getting a bit late in the season.
Marcel Chandler's property south of Barcaldine received 280 millimetres yesterday, the biggest fall since records began on the property more than 80 years ago.
The old rainfall chart back to 1939. Nothing ever in the records for that amount of rain in a 24-hour period.
Floodwaters are lapping at the doors of some residents in Longreach. Most are taking it in their stride, but for Nikita Shute, it's too close for comfort.
We couldn't do anything really. We just moved all our stuff.
The Weather Bureau says the trough has weakened and the heaviest falls have now passed, but there'll be plenty of mopping up to do. Lily Nothling, ABC News, Townsville.
Logan, south of Brisbane, has become the first place in the southern hemisphere to turn human waste into renewable energy, opening Australia's first biosolids gasification plant. The process also produces a high-grade fertiliser to be sold to the agricultural sector.
This may come from human waste, but doesn't smell like it.
Well, it doesn't smell like sewage, I'll tell you now.
The first of its kind in the southern hemisphere, Logan Water's biosolids gasification plant is now operational.
It's quite a complex little piece of engineering.
Water is taken out of the sewage sludge, which is then dried out before going into a furnace where it is burnt and the gases produced are used to power the facility. What remains is a substance called biochar.
So the idea really came from the trucking problem, that we were sending an enormous number of trucks through the community, using a lot of diesel, and it was costing us a lot of money.
Logan City Council says it will reduce carbon emissions by about 6,000 tonnes a year.
It's pushing us towards carbon neutrality, and it's obviously helping the world overcome its issues. If we had one of these in China, everywhere in China, the world would be a much better place.
The $28 million project has taken 18 months to build, with a $6 million injection from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. The biochar will be used as a high-grade fertiliser in the agricultural sector and to make building materials.
The council is working with scientists at QUT in Brisbane to see what other ways this product can be used in the future.
One thing we're looking at is that we might be able to activate the carbon and use it as an odour control source, for instance.
We will explore every marketable opportunity to obviously get the best return.
Louisa Rebgetz, ABC News, Logan.
The New Zealand Warriors have suffered the worst loss in their history, a humiliating 70 points to 10 hiding at the hands of the Melbourne Storm. The home team scored 54 unanswered points in the second half, which is the most since the NRL began. Winger Xavier Coates finished with 4 tries and 6 of his teammates crossed the lines on a horrible night for the Warriors.
Olam versus Walsh. The speedster can't stop the powerhouse.
It's disappointing to actually sit here and say that, but some people looked for the easiest way out they could, and that's sad.
The 70 points to 10 result equalled the Storm's highest score, which came against the Dragons in the year 2000. Targa Tasmania competitors have set off for this year's 30th anniversary of the event. But as it hits the milestone, the well-known rally will be different. The deaths of 3 competitors last year have prompted a raft of new rules.
A ceremonial start in Launceston kicked off this year's Targa Tasmania. Cars being flagged away at a sedate pace before things quickened up for the annual rally.
You know, the early years they often joked about this thing would never see 30 years, let alone 10 years, 5 years.
Just under 500 cars are taking part in this year's event, a record field to mark the race's 30th year. But as well as a celebration of the milestone, the event is also coming back from tragedy. 3 competitors were killed in last year's Targa, forcing sweeping safety changes. Targa now has a speed limit of 200 kilometres an hour. Organisers have also reduced speeds on some crests, jumps and dips that can make cars airborne.
Crests and dips always worried us, even as competitors, like cars leaving the road, some cars are designed to do it, but so many of the cars now are not.
Competitors are embracing the changes.
I am confident that it'll make the event safer. Targa adopted all the recommendations from their full review.
You can't protect everything and everyone, but they've done a really good job to bring it up to as many higher standards as possible.
In the wake of last year's fatal crashes, 23 recommendations were made to better protect competitors.
If you get in a race car, you've got to expect something might happen, but we don't want it to happen.
The event will increasingly focus on touring drivers rather than competitive cars, with the racing field getting smaller each year.
The event's got an amazing future, but probably not as a full-on motorsport event. It's still our DNA, and you'll still see people racing cars at Targa. But the tours, we've gone from 30 to 300 in the last 5 years.
Competitors will take on 34 stages like this one over coming days across hundreds of kilometres of Tasmanian roads. The car rally finishes in Hobart on Sunday. Damien McIntyre, ABC News, Hillwood.
Now with the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
Well, the rain in Queensland is finally easing after more than 300 millimetres around Townsville early today and inland at Longreach 109 millimetres, the biggest one-day total in 33 years. Well, now, after soaking the North Pastoral Districts of South Australia, the bullseye for rain is Western New South Wales. Broken Hill has notched up 51 millimetres in just 12 hours. That rain will head further east tonight and tomorrow and become less intense. There'll also be some showers on the New South Wales coast. In the west, another cold front will bring a fresh burst of rain, maybe thunderstorms tonight to Perth, spreading across the southern inland later in the day. And in western New South Wales, there is a warning of heavy rainfall. 6-hour totals of 40 to 60 millimetres are possible in that yellow area there. In Queensland, showers and thunderstorms over the central interior, also along the coast between Cooktown and Mackay. Patchy rain for the rest of the east coast. Possible showers over the far northern interior and the Gulf country. In Brisbane, you are in for an afternoon shower or two. There's that rain across inland New South Wales, mostly about central and northern areas. The chance of a thunderstorm in the northwest. There'll be showers in the east, and Sydney will have between 8 and 15 millimetres of rain. In Canberra, afternoon showers. Cloudy across Victoria with a few showers on and north of the Divide, maybe 1 or 2 in the south. It'll be an overcast day in Melbourne. For Tasmania, showers increasing about the north and east, spreading to central and southern districts in the evening, and it should stay dry until those evening showers in Hobart. It'll be mostly dry over South Australia, apart from a shower or 2 on and to the east of the ranges, and later in the day over the Nullarbor Plain, partly cloudy in Adelaide. In the west, though, showers and gusty thunderstorms over the southwest land division, Gascoyne, Goldfields, Eucla and the nearby interior. 8 to 15 millimetres of rain on the way for Perth, a possible shower on the Pilbara coast and over far eastern parts of the Barkly and Carpentaria districts, plus across the top end. And Darwin will have afternoon showers and thunderstorms.
And that's ABC Late News. I'm Tane Logan. Thank you for your company this evening. Have a great night.
From Pussy Riot to exile, the Russians leaving in protest at Putin's war.
My hope is that somebody from Putin's circle just will kill him.
Tens of thousands of Russians have fled here to Georgia, all wondering how they can oppose this war and when or if they can ever go home.
He looks like a person who doesn't have access to the right information.
He has lost the connection with the reality.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
What is it going to take for Mr Morrison to simply let this family come home to Billow where they are welcome?
I sympathise, I really do. I feel for them.
Clearly, the Solomon Islands is going to be a base for China. I mean, if you don't believe that, you're very, very naive.
Coming up, Stan Grant is live from Brisbane to hear what's on voters' minds as the election draws closer.
Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What's mad?
Wow. Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch so well crafted. This is exactly what I hoped it would be. That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it? Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Making miniatures calls for surprising ingredients.
Emu feathers.
Tea bags.
Rhubarb seeds. Fish tank stocking.
The tiny team turn their attention to 19th century Adelaide.
This photo is like gold.
And an aerial adventure that caused quite a stir.
There's no safety harness. Crazy.
Tiny Oz.
It's so quiet. It's...
Next Tuesday, 8:30 on ABC TV and streaming on ABC iView.
Police say Mr Justice Opaz was shot with a .22 calibre weapon.
The Parramatta blast shattered brickwork in the forecourt of the empty family court building.
Who premeditated and pre-planned the crimes.
This series of crimes is unparalleled in Australian history.
Len turned around and said, I can shoot you anytime I want to.
The Family Court Murders starts Tuesday, May 10 on ABC TV and ABC iView. To keep streaming on ABC iView,